Sleep didn't restore you. It merely paused the danger. If anything, the medieval night was like nature's loading screen for new and exciting problems. A full 8 hours of rest? Absolutely not. You slept the way a guard dog naps, lightly, suspiciously, and ready for something to fall on you. The good news, you woke up. The bad news, so did everything living in your bed. Hello, travellers. Before we step into the dangerous rhythms of everyday life in medieval Europe, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this story of constant risk. Let's begin with your bed, which, depending on your social status, range from a lumpy pile of straw to a slightly more organised pile of straw. Feathers were possible if you had money, but straw was far more common, and straw came with friends, not the helpful, supportive kind. No, these were the biting, burrowing, bloodthirsty kind that made waking up feel like emerging from a battlefield. Fleas weren't a problem, they were a population. Lice weren't visitors, they were tenants. You didn't get bed bugs, you inherited them. Your bedding wasn't changed often because washing fabric was expensive and time-consuming, so instead, the bedding held onto everything like a medieval scrapbook. Sweat, food crumbs, fire soot, stray hair, moisture, and every insect that ever decided your body tasted like opportunity. Lying down at night didn't mean rest. It meant negotiating with whatever was already in there. Then there was the smell. Oh, the smell. Medieval homes were smoky, damp, and packed with people. Privacy wasn't a concept so much as a wild rumour. Family members slept together, sometimes on the same large mattress, sometimes on mats thrown around the edges of the room. If the house had animals indoors, and many did, from chickens to goats, they slept with you too. Imagine trying to doze off peacefully, while a chicken occasionally hops onto your blanket like it owns the place, or waking up because the family goat has decided your hair looks like breakfast. This happened, often. And then there was the smoke. Chimneys were a luxury in many households. If you didn't have one, you simply let the smoke drift around inside until it found its way out, slowly, reluctantly, and only after converting your lungs into filters. Overnight the smoke settled low, which meant you woke up coughing and blinking through a haze like you'd spent the entire night hotboxing a campfire. Your eyes watered, your throat burned, and your lungs felt like you slept in the exhaust pipe of a wood-burning oven. But waking up itself held other risks. Medieval floors weren't smooth surfaces. They were uneven dirt sprinkled with straw, mud, and the occasional sharp object you did not remember leaving there. When your foot first touched the ground in the morning, you didn't know if it would land on something soft, something sharp, something alive, or something that used to be alive. Any of these were possible outcomes. And let's talk about temperature. There was no thermostat, only the eternal struggle between you and the cold. Winter nights were battles. Without insulation, heat leaked out of homes like a medieval curse escaping a badly sealed tomb. You woke up frozen, stiff, numb fingers fumbling with clothing while your breath fogged the air. Sometimes your water jug froze indoors. Your body heat? Ineffective. Your blanket? Thin. Your chances of waking up comfortable? Nonsense. Summer mornings were no relief either. Without ventilation, houses trapped heat and humidity. Sleeping felt like lying inside a wool-lined oven. Mosquitoes took advantage of your stillness to feast like royalty. You woke up itchy, sweaty, and already exhausted. Ideal conditions for a day of manual labour. Noise didn't help. Roosters crowed long before dawn. Dogs barked in the night. Travellers clattered along the roads, and drunk neighbours loudly reconsidered their life choices outside your window. Medieval mornings didn't gently greet you. They punched you out of unconsciousness like clockwork. And because nights were dark, truly dark, you often didn't know what you were waking up to. Was that a mouse running across your chest? Was that your sibling sleep-kicking you? Was something moving in the straw? Is the house creaking normally? Or is that a warning? Medieval people called these sounds normal night noises. Modern people would call them the beginning of a horror film. Speaking of darkness, the medieval fear of the night wasn't superstition, it was survival instinct. Night was when spirits, demons, and thieves were believed to roam, yes, but it was also literally when people tripped, fell, and hurt themselves. You were cautious about moving in the dark because a fall could cause injuries that didn't heal well. So most people stayed in one place until morning, partly out of fear of the supernatural and partly out of fear of stubbing a toe badly enough to cause long-term problems. Even your dreams weren't restful. Nightmares were often interpreted as omens, punishments, or signs of spiritual weakness. So waking up scared didn't just mean you had a bad dream, it meant you might have a bad day. So as dawn crept in and the sky brightened, medieval people dragged themselves awake knowing that the day's dangers were waiting patiently. Your morning routine wasn't peaceful, it was evaluation. Breath, fog in the air, bed, crawling with life, floor, questionable, room, smoky, limbs, sore, mood, grimly functional, and yet people survived this, daily, not comfortably, not cheerfully, but consistently. Waking up in medieval Europe wasn't just an introduction to the day, it was the first challenge of many, a reminder that danger didn't arrive dramatically, it stayed with you quietly, patiently, all night long. The medieval day started the moment your eyes opened, not with hope, but with alertness. Because the biggest risk of all was letting your guard down, and that was just the morning. If your medieval bed didn't defeat you during the night, congratulations, you now got to face the building you lived in. And building is a generous word. Medieval houses weren't stable, safe, or comfortable. They were temporary agreements with gravity. Homes weren't shelters, they were suggestions. Calling it indoors was optimistic. Let's begin with thatched roofs, the medieval equivalent of wearing a dry haystack as a hat and hoping nothing sparks. Thatched roofs were everywhere because they were cheap, common, and easy to build. They were also the most flammable objects in your daily life, right behind firewood, cloth, and your hopes for a peaceful afternoon. Any stray ember from the hearth, any candle, any lightning bolt, or any overly ambitious spark could turn your roof into a bonfire. Thatched roofs didn't just burn, they erupted. Within minutes, a home could become a flaming beacon, announcing to the village, well, this escalated. And because buildings were packed close together, one fire often turned into many. Entire neighbourhoods vanished in what medieval chroniclers politely described as a great misfortune, which was code for half the town accidentally roasted. Firefighting equipment consisted of buckets, shouting, and a deep sense of panic. Now step inside, if your doorway doesn't try to knock you unconscious first. Medieval door frames weren't standardized. They were whatever height the builder felt emotionally prepared to create. Many were low, forcing people to duck every time they entered, exited, or forgot they needed to duck. Concussions were part of the architecture. The floors were another hazard entirely. Wealthy homes might have wooden planks, but most living spaces, especially for peasants, had dirt floors. Dirt floors are fine when dry, which was almost never. Spill water, mud, spit, mud, drop soup, mud, rain seep through the wall, mud. Chickens walk across the room leaving gifts, mixed into the mud. Daily life constantly produced a slippery, uneven surface full of mystery substances. The kind of place where walking felt like playing a medieval version of Don't Step on That. Even when homes upgraded from dirt to wood floors, it didn't eliminate danger, it just added splinters. Large, painful, deeply committed splinters. Wood wasn't sanded, polished, or smoothed. It simply existed, much like your back pain. And then we arrive at the walls, the quiet assassins of medieval architecture. Some walls were made of wattle and daub, a charming combination of sticks, mud, straw, and prayer. Others were simple timber frames filled with whatever material was nearby. These walls could warp, crack, lean, or collapse, depending on the season, the weather, or whether someone breathed on them incorrectly. If you leaned on them for support, sometimes they leaned back, sometimes violently. To add character and danger, many homes had upper floors that jutted out over the lower ones. This jettying saved street space and looked pretty, but if the timber wasn't properly maintained, the upper floor could detach. Medieval houses occasionally shed parts of themselves like disgruntled cats, dropping beams, debris and roofing onto unsuspecting villagers. Then there was ventilation, or more accurately, the medieval lack of interest in it. Without chimneys in many homes, smoke drifted through the house until it found a crack or hole to escape through. The walls and ceilings collected soot like it was a competitive sport. Over time, layers of soot built up thick enough to fall off in chunks, especially if the house shook in a storm. Imagine trying to eat breakfast while soot flakes drifted down like the world's least festive snow. Moisture didn't help either. Leaky roofs and porous walls meant rainwater regularly entered the home, soaking bedding, clothing and floor straw. With dampness came mould, mildew, and a general air quality that modern people would describe as deeply concerning. But medieval people didn't have modern standards. Mould wasn't a health risk, it was a roommate. Temperature control also didn't exist. Homes were either freezing cold or uncomfortably hot depending on the season. Insulation was a concept your walls had not heard of, and drafts flew through the gaps with the confidence of uninvited guests. You could sit indoors wrapped in layers, hugging the fire, and still be cold enough to question your life choices. Then there was the roof maintenance issue. People occasionally kept livestock in lofts, yes, above their heads. Chickens, pigeons, even goats sometimes lived in upper sections of the house. These animals contributed droppings. Droppings fell through cracks in the boards, sometimes onto you. This is not an exaggeration. Medieval people literally got pooped on by their ceilings. Insects lived in every nook and cranny. Beetles, spiders and fleas made themselves at home in the thatch, the walls, the floors, and anything else that looked vaguely habitable. Your house wasn't your fortress. It was their kingdom, and you were a tolerated intruder. And let's not forget structural unpredictability. Homes deteriorated quickly because timber rotted, pests weakened beams, storms damaged roofs, and repair work cost money people didn't have. It wasn't uncommon for a house to list to one side like a drunken sailor. If the walls sagged, people propped them up with wooden beams. If the roof sagged, people hoped it wouldn't fall today. In short, medieval houses weren't construction projects, they were survival challenges. They protected you from the weather, but not reliably. They sheltered you from the outside world, but introduced their own hazards. They stood upright, most of the time. A medieval home might keep you alive, but it also might surprise you in ways that involved falling beams and emergency bucket lines. Living indoors didn't mean safety. It simply meant you had relocated the danger into a smaller space. And the house was just the beginning. Fire in medieval Europe was less a household utility and more an unpredictable roommate, warm, helpful, occasionally comforting, and fully capable of destroying everything you loved without warning. You didn't use fire. You lived with fire. You respected it, feared it, relied on it, and apologized to it when it misbehaved. Fire kept you warm, fed you, and occasionally deleted your address. Let's start with the hearth, the fiery heart of the medieval home. Unlike modern stoves that politely contained flames inside metal walls, the medieval hearth was simply an open blaze sitting in the center of a room, spreading heat, ash, sparks, and mild panic. Most homes didn't have chimneys, so smoke filled the air, turned the ceiling black, and seeped through whatever cracks the house generously offered. Cooking over such a fire meant leaning into a hot, smoky chaos that wanted nothing more than to singe your eyebrows off. Just making breakfast required courage. You crouched low, squinting through rising smoke, poking at boiling pots suspended over open flames by iron hooks that got dangerously hot. One wrong move and the hot hook branded you. One wobble of a pot and boiling stew landed on your foot. Fire didn't just cook your meals, It maintained a hostile stance at all times. But even when the fire behaved, it still created hazards. Embers popped, sparks snapped, and ash drifted everywhere like confetti from a destructive parade. A single spark could leap from the hearth, land in the straw on the floor, and suddenly you were reorganizing your entire living situation with a bucket of water and a prayer. The medieval fear of runaway flames wasn't superstition, it was life experience. Now, let's move outdoors. Fire wasn't confined to the home. Blacksmiths, bakers, brewers, and potters used large open flames every single day. Medieval towns practically ran on fire, which would have been fine if fire itself wasn't something that actively despised being controlled. Take the baker's oven. These ovens burned hotter than the gossip at the village well. They were essential and dangerous. It wasn't uncommon for a baker's oven to overheat, crack, or spill sparks onto the thatched rooftops around it. Towns sometimes banned private baking ovens because they kept burning down neighborhoods. Imagine telling people, you can't bake bread at home because the entire street is tired of spontaneously combusting. That was real ordinances-level logic. Brewers weren't safe either. Boiling cauldrons, wooden barrels, and constant fire exposure made brewing a hazardous profession. A brewer who wasn't paying attention could end up with a spilled vat of boiling mash, which spread fast and cooked anything in its path. Ironically, beer was safer to drink than water, but more dangerous to make. Then there's the charming concept of medieval lighting. No electricity, no switches, just torches, candles, and oil lamps. Basically portable fire hazards held by people who were tired, distracted, or slightly drunk at any given hour. Candles were especially troublesome. They were made from tallow, which melted easily, bent in the heat, and dripped flaming fat onto wooden tables. Medieval people placed candles near beds, near curtains, near clothing, near pets, near their hair, essentially everywhere you would never put a flame today unless you were specifically trying to summon the fire brigade. Oil lamps weren't much better. They spilled, they smoked, they cracked, and if you ever dropped one, you suddenly had a flaming puddle spreading across the floor like a medieval boss battle. Now imagine all these hazards concentrated in a densely packed medieval town. Houses crowded together shoulder to shoulder. Upper floors hung over the street. Thatched roofs touched like friendly neighbours or future kindling. A fire in one home rarely stayed in one home. It leapt, it raced, it celebrated its freedom by taking half the street with it. Records tell us of fires that consumed marketplaces, churches, entire neighbourhoods. Chroniclers didn't bother with firefighter statistics or damage reports. They simply wrote, and the fire spared nothing. Some towns burned so often that they rebuilt using the ashes from the last disaster, only to repeat the cycle in a few years. And it wasn't just buildings. Fire attacked people too. Clothing caught easily, especially wool cloaks that brushed too close to a spark. Women working near the hearth risked their skirts igniting if fabric met flame. Children playing too close to the fire could tumble in. Burns were common, painful, and could lead to infection. People learned early, fire warmed you, until it didn't. Yet despite the danger, medieval life revolved around fire. It heated your water, dried your wet clothing, baked your bread, forged your tools, and kept the wolves of winter at bay. People couldn't live without it, even though sometimes they couldn't live with it either. So medieval households struck a fragile compromise. Fire could stay, but only if everyone remained alert. Watch the sparks, cover embers at night, keep the flammable things far away, keep children and animals supervised. Hope the wind didn't pick up. Pray that lightning avoided your home. Fire was a daily companion, hovering at the edge of disaster. It was warmth, comfort, danger, and destruction bundled together in a single flickering flame. You respected fire the same way you respected a moody lord, humble, cautious, alert, and hoping today wouldn't be the day everything burned down. In medieval Europe, fire didn't just cook your meals. It decided whether you would still have a kitchen by sunset. Drinking water in medieval Europe wasn't a refreshment. It was a negotiation. Every sip came with hope, fear, and a brief moment where you wondered if this would be the day your stomach declared mutiny. Clean water was rare, wells were contaminated, and rivers doubled as sewers. Hydration often came with consequences. You didn't choose drinks for flavour, you chose them for survivability. Let's start with wells, the medieval idea of safe water. And by safe we mean safer than licking moss, but only slightly. Wells were often dug close to homes or communal gathering spots, which sounds convenient until you remember medieval sanitation was theoretical. Waste pits, latrines, manure heaps, animal pens and butchering sites were often nearby, sometimes too nearby. Rain washed everything downward into the soil, and the soil happily delivered it into the well. When the bucket came up full, the water might look clear, but clarity meant nothing. Bacteria doesn't wave hello. People knew well water could make them sick, but options were limited. You either drank it or waited for dehydration to do the job instead. So they prayed, hoped, and occasionally added herbs or charcoal to reduce the character of the flavour. It didn't fix the problem, it just hid the warning signs. Next were streams and rivers, places where nature provided water and humans immediately ruined it. Rivers were not gentle freshwater sources shimmering under sunlight. They were running highways of refuse. Animals drank from them. Villagers washed clothes in them. Tanners dumped chemicals into them. Butchers tossed scraps into them, and everyone used them as convenient disposal systems. And then there were the latrines overhanging water channels. Yes, those existed. Some towns built toilets directly above streams, so waste was carried away out of sight, out of mind, except downstream users who very much minded. River water was an ecosystem of things you didn't want to think about but absolutely ingested. People tried to fetch water upstream if they could, but upstream was often someone else's downstream, and because medieval towns were dense, compact, and bursting with daily activity, contamination wasn't occasional. It was constant. Drinking directly from a river was like rolling dice with your internal organs. Rainwater might seem like a safe alternative, but collecting it came with issues. Roofs were filthy, gutters were basic channels of dirt and decay, and cisterns weren't sanitized. Rain barrels collected everything falling off the roof. Bits of straw, dust, dead insects, bird droppings, and whatever the wind blew in that week. It was natural in the worst possible way. Because water sources were unreliable, people turned to other beverages, not for taste, but because boiling or fermenting made them less deadly. This gave rise to what historians lovingly call small beer. Small beer wasn't the medieval version of a refreshing lager. It was weakly fermented, mildly alcoholic liquid brewed specifically so people could safely hydrate without collapsing later. Children drank it. Workers drank it. Everyone drank it. It was closer to watery bread juice than actual beer, but at least you wouldn't explode internally after drinking it. For those who could afford it, wine was an option. But wine ranged broadly in quality, from sour, borderline vinegar for everyday meals to decent barrels for special occasions. Even so, wine was diluted with water, partly to stretch supplies and partly because everyone knew water alone was suspicious, unless it had been fixed by mixing it with something fermented. The goal wasn't intoxication, it was prevention. Boiling water worked, obviously. Medieval people weren't clueless, but boiling took fuel, time, and effort, all scarce commodities. Most households used boiling only for cooking. Drinking boiled water on its own wasn't common unless someone was sick, in which case they were already regretting their earlier beverage choices. And then there were the truly desperate water sources: puddles, ponds, marshes, and snowmelt. Travellers drank whatever they found. Soldiers drank from ditches. Shepherds drank from streams their sheep walked through seconds earlier. Cleanliness wasn't part of the decision-making process. Availability was. These risky drinking habits contributed to high rates of digestive illness, though medieval people didn't know why. They blamed cursed air, imbalanced humours, foul vapours, suspicious neighbours, the alignment of the stars, anything except the very obvious explanation floating in their wooden cup. Stomach issues were so common that they were simply considered part of life. Diarrhea wasn't a medical condition, it was a recurring event. Waterborne disease outbreaks happened regularly, usually just called flux, fever, or a visitation. People didn't seek cures, they sought survival. Medieval households developed routines to minimize water danger. They fetched water early in the morning when it looked clearer. They avoided drawing from stagnant wells. They sometimes let water settle to allow sediment to drop to the bottom. They flavored water with herbs or flowers, not to make it taste nice, but to hide signs of trouble. Villages with access to springs were considered blessed. Springs were naturally filtered and safer, so communities guarded them fiercely. A spring wasn't just water, it was life insurance. Ironically, the safest water came in frozen form, but melting snow was slow and precious, used mostly for cooking or emergency hydration. People preferred to save firewood for warmth rather than making safer beverages. All of this made drinking water a daily gamble. Every sip had stakes. Life expectancy wasn't just affected by famine, disease, or poverty. It was affected by the simple act of trying not to die of thirst. So in medieval Europe, the question wasn't what would you like to drink, it was what are you willing to risk today? Hydration was necessary, survival was uncertain, and the water was always judging you. Medieval food didn't just challenge your palate, it challenged your structural integrity. Every meal was a test of durability, bravery, and dental survival. Grinding stones chipped into bread, bones hid in stews, and teeth routinely shattered on meals. Eating wasn't nourishment, it was mechanical risk. Dinner didn't fill you up, it tested your jaw. Before we even get to the table, let's talk about how food was made, because the dangers didn't appear magically, they were built into the process. Take bread, the cornerstone of medieval diets. Bread should be simple, flour, water, yeast. But medieval flour wasn't sifted with delicate modern machinery. It was ground on stone, often between two rough surfaces that shed tiny fragments. These fragments became bonus minerals in your bread, except these minerals didn't help your bones, they chipped your teeth. Over time, eating coarse bread wore teeth down to nubs. Archaeologists can identify medieval skeletons just from the grinding damage. The bread wasn't cutting edge, but it cut you, and this bread was everywhere. Poorer households baked loaves so dense they could double as defensive tools. If dinner didn't break your teeth, you could throw the leftovers at robbers. Some loaves were baked once a week and hardened over time, meaning by day 6 you weren't slicing bread, you were negotiating with it. Eating required soaking hunks in broth to soften them, which worked unless the bread hit a stone shard you didn't see until crunch. Too late. Now let's examine stews, the medieval multi-tool of cooking. Stews were practical because you could toss in whatever you had. Vegetables, herbs, meat scraps, suspicious leftovers, or questionable ingredients you hoped heat would redeem. Bones were a standard feature. Big bones, small bones, splintered bones. Take your pick. A single bowl of stew could contain a dozen tiny booby traps waiting for your molars. People bit carefully, chewed cautiously, and swallowed prayerfully. The term bone broth wasn't marketing, it was a warning. Meat itself came with additional danger. Medieval butchering wasn't performed with surgical precision. Cuts were rough, tools dull, hands unsteady, and everything was done quickly. Bones splintered, gristle clung to everything. And you often didn't know which part of the animal you were chewing until it pushed back. If you got a tough cut, you chewed and chewed until your jaw clicked like a medieval drum. Fish offered variety but introduced their own hazards. Tiny bones hid in every bite, ready to lodge themselves in your throat and end the meal with a visit to the local healer, who might prescribe honey, herbs, or a nice soft candle to swallow, none of which fixed the issue. Fish bones didn't discriminate. They punctured kings and peasants equally. But even vegetables were riskier than modern eaters imagine. Roots were dug from the ground, washed casually, or not at all, and chopped into soups. Dirt clung to everything. Grit lurked in every bite. Pottery shards sometimes fell into food from cracked cooking vessels. Small objects broke off utensils. Everything that fell into the pot stayed in the pot because food wastage wasn't an option. You weren't eating a pure carrot, you were eating a carrot and whatever it brought along for the ride. Then we reached the experience of actual eating, which medieval people approached with the seriousness of a duel. Chewing was a full-body commitment. Meals required concentration. Your teeth had to navigate bone fragments, unground grain, tough fibres, and foreign particles that didn't belong in anything meant for humans. Dental care was practically non-existent. If a tooth cracked on a stone in your bread, that was simply life. You had to chew around it for months. If the tooth shattered entirely, you removed it with whatever tools you had. A knife, a nail, a brave friend, and then hoped infection didn't follow. Toothache wasn't an inconvenience. It was a full crisis event. Medieval diners also faced the danger of hard rations, especially travellers and soldiers. Hardtack was so dense it could survive decades. Some pieces were so famously difficult that sailors carved things into them, as if the bread had aspirations of becoming furniture. People softened hardtack by smashing it with a hammer, soaking it in beer, or pretending it wasn't as solid as it felt. Eating it straight was an act of desperation or immense confidence in your teeth. Cakes and pastries weren't much safer. Sweetness existed mostly at festivals, when honey or imported sugar appeared. But cakes often contained unprocessed flour, stray eggshells, or hard nuts that caught you off guard. Nothing was ever uniformly smooth, and we haven't even reached the danger of cooking implements. Pots were heavy, metal was uneven, and food often burned on the bottom. That burned scrap sometimes broke loose and mixed into your meal. Grates and spits shed flecks of metal. Bread could include bits of the oven floor. Everything, it seemed, collaborated to make your meal crunchy in ways it should not have been. Even the act of cutting your own food was a hazard. At the table, people used personal knives, sharp, pointed, and absolutely ready to slip if your bread resisted, and it always resisted. One tough loaf, one stubborn root vegetable, and suddenly the meal involved bloodshed. Not an uncommon occurrence. All of this meant that medieval people approached food with caution. They chewed slowly, tested textures, and learned to interpret the difference between normal crunch and crunch that signals immediate dental regret. Eating wasn't a simple biological necessity. It was a medieval sport. Your opponents were bones, stones, grit, and the physical limitations of your own teeth. And no matter the meal, every bite whispered the same reminder. Are you sure you want to commit to this? Hunger in medieval Europe wasn't a seasonal inconvenience. It was a permanent background noise, humming quietly behind even the most ordinary days. One bad harvest could doom entire regions. Hunger wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and everywhere. The pantry wasn't empty. It was emotionally disappointing. Let's begin with the harvest itself, the fragile heart of medieval food security. Crops depended on a series of events that had to go exactly right. The soil had to be fertile enough, the spring rains gentle enough, the summer sun warm enough, the autumn dry enough, and the pests uninterested enough. That last one never happened. Medieval agriculture was a full-scale negotiation with nature, where the slightest misbehaviour from the weather meant thousands of people would quietly slide towards starvation over the next year. Rain too early, seeds washed away. Rain too late, plants withered. Too much sun, dust bowl. Too little sun, mould and rot. A hailstorm at the wrong moment. Winter came early, served with a side of panic. Medieval farmers didn't have modern fertilizers, irrigation, or pest control. Their tools were simple, their animals stubborn, and their ability to predict weather based on cloud shapes and the personalities of cows was famously unreliable. So even in good years, years when fields were green and yields seemed decent, farmers operated with a deep, ancient fear. What if it's not enough? Because here's the problem. Good was relative. A decent yield might keep a household fed, but not comfortably. If you had enough grain to last until next harvest, you were lucky. If you had extra to sell, you were exceptional. But most people had barely enough, so they rationed aggressively. Bread was cut thinner, pottage was stretched with more water, meals got smaller as winter dragged on. And then came the lean months, those final desperate weeks before the next harvest. Medieval people even had a term for this period, the hunger gap. Stores ran low, gardens hadn't produced yet, livestock grew thin, and the last dried beans rattled in their sacks like ominous maracas. You didn't starve instantly. You starved slowly, thoughtfully, with growing irritation and a stomach that never stopped filing complaints. During the hunger gap, people ate whatever they had left. Maybe that was old grain, stored so long it had weevils crawling through it, like microscopic protein supplements. Maybe it was roots forgotten in the cellar that had decided to sprout new life forms. Maybe it was dried peas so shriveled they needed hours of soaking just to become chewable. People didn't complain. They couldn't. They needed every calorie. Now, consider the emotional reality of food storage. Medieval pantries were not spacious rooms with neat shelves and organized jars. They were dark corners, clay pots, wooden bins, or cellars that smelled faintly like mold and desperation. Grain sacks compressed over time, not because food was plentiful, but because the family was eating it faster than the world could replenish it. A medieval pantry didn't run out. It dwindled steadily, painfully, visibly. Every family watched the supply shrink and prayed for the harvest to arrive before the food ran out completely. And then there were famines, the full nightmare scenario. Famines didn't come often, but when they did, they reshaped entire generations. Crops failed across multiple regions at once. Livestock died for lack of fodder. Children weakened first, followed by the elderly, followed by adults who simply couldn't find enough calories to keep working. Famine wasn't theatrical. It was quiet. It was resigned. It was the slow unraveling of communities as meals shrank from bowls to handfuls to nothing. People survived however they could. They boiled grass, they ate bark, they gathered nettles, acorns, and anything that vaguely resembled edible matter. Some relied on charity from monasteries, places that kept emergency stores but never enough for everyone. Others scavenged. Some travelled from village to village, begging for leftover crumbs. And even in non-famine years, medieval diets were shockingly thin. Most people ate the same things over and over: bread, pottage, maybe dairy if they had animals, maybe a bit of salted fish on special days. Meat was rare, fruit seasonal, spices expensive. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was boring. The culinary variety of medieval life could be fully summarized as edible monotony. Then there was the problem of preservation. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Salt could preserve meat, but salt was expensive. Smoking and drying helped, but only for certain foods. Vegetables rotted fast. Milk turned sour within hours. Cheese lasted longer, but not forever. Even grain could go bad if moisture seeped into the sacks. And if rats reached the pantry before you did, congratulations, you now lived in the rodent economy. Rats and mice were relentless. They chewed through sacks, nibbled stores, and left behind droppings that technically counted as seasoning, but in practice counted as a health hazard. Families fought rodents with traps, cats, and sheer willpower. Sometimes the rodents won. A truly wealthy household stocked enough food to weather shortages, but most medieval families lived too close to the edge. They knew hunger well. They recognized its symptoms. They feared its arrival more than almost anything else. And so, even in a good year, a year without floods, plagues, or crop failures, starvation hovered in the background like a quiet, hungry ghost. You thought about it every time you filled your bowl, every time you looked at your shrinking stores, every time the weather changed suddenly. Hunger wasn't a crisis. It was a companion. Not immediate, but always waiting, always watching, and always reminding you that the pantry didn't lie. It was as disappointing as life allowed it to be. Medieval Europe had no concept of separating humans from animals. Everyone lived together: people, livestock, pests, working beasts, and creatures that simply wandered through the door uninvited. Animals were everywhere and none were safe. Livestock lived indoors, bit without warning, and spread disease freely. Even helpful animals could kill you by accident. Your cow loved you. It could still end you. Let's start with living conditions, because medieval households weren't the neat pastoral scenes we imagine from storybooks. In poorer homes, animals literally shared the same single-floor living space. Cows slept in stalls beside the family. Chickens wandered indoors hunting insects. Goats climbed on anything that wasn't moving fast enough. Pigs, shockingly intelligent, explored the house with a curious nose and absolutely no respect for boundaries. These weren't pets, these were assets. Livestock meant milk, meat, wool, labour, fertiliser, or trade value. But they also meant noise, chaos and risk. You could be jolted awake by a chicken landing on you, knocked over by a goat seeking attention, or pinned against a wall because your cow decided you were standing in its favourite spot. Animals had no schedules. They woke when they wanted, made noise when they wanted, relieved themselves wherever inspiration struck, and occasionally reacted to shadows, loud noises, or dust motes as if facing an existential threat. Medieval people accepted all of this as normal, but normal didn't mean safe. Cows. Cows were one of the most valuable assets a medieval family could own, but they were also massive, unpredictable, and prone to sudden mood swings. A startled cow could kick you hard enough to fracture bones. A cow defending her calf could toss you aside like laundry. And because cows lived close, often in cramped barns or even inside shared human spaces, accidents happened constantly. People learned to milk cautiously, avoiding the death kick zone, and paid close attention to the cow's ears. Small movements often indicated big trouble. One annoyed cow in a small space could deliver a bad day instantly. Horses. Working horses were essential for ploughing, hauling and transportation. They were also incredibly dangerous for anyone not fully aware of their temperament. Horses bite, horses kick, horses trample. Medieval horses weren't pampered stable champions. They were working-class giants with powerful legs and minimal patience. A single misstep around a horse could break ribs or skulls. And because horses worked in fields, forests and muddy roads, one slip could crush a person beneath 1,000 pounds of muscle. Pigs. Pigs deserve special mention because they were famously bold, incredibly strong, and surprisingly aggressive. Medieval pigs didn't resemble the docile pink creatures of modern farms. They were bristly, muscular, territorial, and notoriously clever. They could knock over small children, chase adults, and bite with alarming force. And yes, pigs occasionally attacked or even killed people, especially if startled or hungry. A pig pen was not a place for daydreaming. Goats were the medieval agents of chaos. They climbed, jumped, and inserted themselves into situations simply because physics dared them to. Goats ate anything resembling food, including clothing, shoes, rope, baskets, and occasionally items you were actively using. They headbutted without warning and treated every flat surface as a trampoline. No one in medieval Europe trusted a goat entirely, and for good reason. Chickens and geese chickens were mostly harmless, unless you tried to take their eggs. But geese were demons with feathers. Medieval geese guarded property like trained soldiers, honking aggressively and charging anyone who came too close. A goose could bruise your shins, rip your clothing, and permanently alter your opinion of poultry. People respected geese more than some landlords. Dogs and cats. Dogs weren't bred for friendliness. They were working animals. Some guarded property, some herded livestock, some hunted. Many were semi-feral. A dog could be loyal one moment and fierce the next, especially if startled or hungry. Cats, meanwhile, were valued for mouse control but not pampered. Medieval cats lived on the edge of survival, dodging danger and tolerating humans only because humans tolerated them. They scratched, hissed, and fled unpredictably. But people kept them because rodents were much worse. Rats and mice. Speaking of rodents, medieval buildings, warehouses, and barns were full of them. Rats spread disease, ate food stores, chewed through sacks and wood, and reproduced with alarming enthusiasm. They slipped into homes at night, scurried across beds, and caused untold levels of contamination. Rats weren't just pests. They were dangerous, persistent companions of everyday life. Disease animals didn't just injure people, they spread illness. Zoonotic diseases were common. A person could fall sick from contaminated milk, diseased meat, flea bites, animal droppings, or infected scratches. People didn't fully understand why animals transmitted sickness. They just knew that proximity came with risks. Livestock infections sometimes spread to entire communities. Outbreaks of rinderpest, swine fever, or murrain devastated herds, destroying food sources and livelihoods overnight. Work accidents. Animals weren't just hazards indoors, they were dangerous outdoors too. Ploughing with oxen required strength and coordination. One slip of the yoke or sudden lurch of the animal could throw the farmer off balance and drag him. Shepherds could be crushed under sheep during panicked stampedes. Stable hands risked kicks, trampling, and bites daily. The medieval relationship with animals was practical, necessary, and balanced on a thin line between cooperation and chaos. The medieval mindset. Medieval people weren't naive. They respected animals deeply, sometimes fearfully. They understood that every creature had its own will and its own dangers. They learned body language, habits, temperaments. They adapted, compromised, and accepted risk as part of survival. Your cow fed you. Your horse worked for you. Your pigs fattened for winter. Your chickens laid eggs. Your goats provided milk. But at any moment, any of them could remind you that you were not in charge of nature. You were merely borrowing it. Animals were everywhere. Animals were essential. Animals were dangerous. And medieval life was lived in their shadow, step by unpredictable step. If the medieval home was dangerous and the medieval animals were unpredictable, then stepping outside introduced an entirely new environment of hazards. Streets weren't public spaces, they were obstacle courses of filth. Mud, waste, carcasses and roaming animals turned walking into a survival skill. Falling over could be fatal. Urban planning meant aim for the least disgusting path. Begin by imagining a medieval street, not the romanticized cobblestone lanes from tourist brochures, but the realistic versions described in letters, complaints, and laws. Most streets weren't paved. They were dirt routes compacted by thousands of footsteps, wagon wheels, and hooves. When it rained, these streets transformed into deep, sticky mud that swallowed shoes, trapped cartwheels, and occasionally ate livestock. This mud wasn't pure mud. Absolutely not. It was a horrifying cocktail of soil, food scraps, spilled ale, animal droppings, human waste, butchery runoff, and whatever washed down from the upper floors of houses. The smell lingered like an unwelcome roommate. And the texture ranged from soft enough to ruin your day to dense enough to ruin your month. Walking through town was an exercise in strategy. You scanned for safe spots, jumped over suspicious puddles, tiptoed around gutter streams, and prayed your footing didn't betray you. People wore sturdy shoes not for fashion, but because the street wanted to eat them. Then there were open drains, flowing continuously along the edges of the street like slow-moving rivers of everything you hoped to avoid. These drains collected chamber pot contents, kitchen waste, stable runoff, spilled drinks, and rainwater that blended everything into an aromatic stew. Falling into one was not just disgusting, it could cause infections, injuries, or diseases. And falling was easy. Streets were uneven, full of potholes, loose stones, broken planks, and random debris dropped from carts. You could stumble on a root, slip in mud, collide with a neighbour, or lose your footing when avoiding an oncoming animal. Speaking of animals, they were everywhere. Dogs roamed freely, sniffing, barking, and sometimes getting aggressive. Pigs wandered the streets vacuuming up scraps, occasionally knocking into people with their surprising strength. Horses and oxen pulled carts, and when startled, they could trample someone unlucky enough to be in front of them. Even geese patrolled alleyways with the confidence of hired guards. And all of these creatures did what animals do. They left droppings, constantly, in great volume. Medieval streets were never free of manure. You stepped over it, you stepped around it, you stepped in it. Sometimes it was fresh, sometimes dried, and sometimes hidden under mud, waiting to introduce your shoes to new textures. But the streets had other horrors beyond mud and manure. They hosted trash piles, formed from households tossing their waste directly outside. The street cleaner was gravity. Leftover fish bones, spoiled vegetables, broken pottery, rotten fruit, eggshells, all thrown into the street. Food markets contributed even more waste, leaving behind heaps of bones, guts, and rejected produce. Then came carcasses, unfortunate animals that collapsed on the road or died during transport. Removing them wasn't always immediate. Sometimes they just stayed until someone with time, patience, or a strong stomach dragged them away. Until then, people walked past or around them as flies buzzed and decomposition progressed. It was not uncommon to see a pig rooting around near a dead horse. Medieval nature did not believe in boundaries. When it didn't rain, streets became dusty. The dust wasn't clean, it was pulverized waste. Wind whipped up clouds of it that stuck to clothes, hair, and lungs. Inhaling medieval street dust was like sampling the entire town's garbage in powdered form, and if you think nights were better, they weren't. At night, streets had no lighting. People navigated by moonlight or memory, dodging hazards they couldn't see. Tripping over an obstacle wasn't just annoying. It could lead to broken bones, sprains, or worse. A twisted ankle could mean weeks of reduced mobility, which in the medieval world was genuinely dangerous. Let's talk about traffic, because medieval streets weren't quiet. Wagons rattled through constantly. Drivers shouted. Wheels splashed mud onto anyone too close. Oxen lumbered without concern for pedestrians. Carts tipped over. And because everything crowded together, one small mistake could create a chain reaction of chaos. Streets weren't designed for order. They were arenas of improvisation. Next, we encounter the dangers from above. Medieval buildings often had upper stories that jutted out over the road. This was great for homeowners who wanted extra space, but less great for pedestrians. People on the top floors regularly threw waste out of their windows, often announcing it with a shout like "Guard low," meaning watch out for water, which was generous phrasing because it wasn't water. The warning was optional. Sometimes the waste simply fell. A poorly timed stroll beneath a window meant you could be hit by dishwater, scraps of food, or far worse substances. Falling objects also included broken pottery, loose wood, laundry, or the occasional frustrated cat being relocated by force. In wealthier towns, authorities attempted to enforce regulations like designated dumping zones, street gutters, or market cleanups. But these rules were inconsistently applied, often ignored, and impossible to maintain during festivals or market days. The streets became rivers of debris, noise, and smells. Crime also lurked in the streets. Narrow alleys, dim corners, and crowded paths were ideal for pickpockets, opportunists, and desperate individuals. While this wasn't the primary danger of medieval streets, filth still held that title. The combination of physical hazards and human ones created an environment where vigilance was constant. Despite all this, medieval people adapted. They knew the cleanest routes. They learned when to walk, where to step, and which paths were safest. Some carried sticks to test puddles. Some walked on raised wooden planks when available. Some just shrugged and trudged through everything with resigned determination. But no matter how careful you were, the medieval street remained a living organism, loud, crowded, filthy, and unforgiving. Navigating it wasn't just travel, it was survival choreography. One wrong step and the street would remind you why least disgusting was often the best case scenario. Illness in medieval Europe didn't politely announce itself. It arrived uninvited, moved silently, and spread faster than rumours, gossip, and even royal scandals. With no germ theory, no isolation, and no real understanding of how disease worked, sickness moved invisibly and efficiently through daily contact. You didn't catch sickness, you were assigned it. Let's begin with the fundamental problem. No one knew what caused disease. People had explanations, of course. They just weren't accurate. Illness came from bad air, from blocked humours, from divine punishment, from proximity to sinful neighbours, from astrology, from looking at the wrong person at the wrong time, or, a personal favourite, from wandering spirits that latched onto your body when you least expected it. Germs were not part of the conversation, not even as a theory, not even as a wild guess. This misunderstanding meant medieval people took the wrong precautions and skipped the right ones completely. They closed windows on hot days because night air was considered evil, but they happily attended crowded markets filled with coughing strangers. They avoided eating cold fruit, but shared drinking bowls with travellers. They prayed for health, but didn't think twice about letting livestock lick their hands before preparing dinner. Now, imagine this lack of knowledge happening in environments absolutely perfect for disease transmission. Homes were cramped, streets were filthy, water was questionable, animals lived everywhere, and personal space was a concept that had not been invented yet. Households of 6 or 8 slept in one room. Public gatherings filled every corner of daily life. Churches, markets, taverns, guild halls, fairs, processions, festivals, funerals. Anyone ill was guaranteed to share their condition with dozens of others before lunch. And because disease was invisible, people didn't change their habits when symptoms began. A medieval person with a fever still went to work, because not working meant not eating. Someone with a nasty cough still attended church, because missing Mass risked the soul more than infecting the neighbour. If your child had spots or rashes, you simply hoped they weren't the dangerous kind, but you still sent them outside to play. This environment turned minor illnesses into community-wide problems. A simple respiratory infection could sweep through families. A stomach illness could jump across entire neighbourhoods. And because medieval medicine had no concept of microbes, no one understood that washing hands or boiling water could stop a disease in its tracks. Sickness moved freely, passing through villages like an impatient traveller, leaving weakened bodies behind. We also need to consider the speed of medieval travel, because while it was slow for people, it was fast enough for disease. Merchants, pilgrims, monks, soldiers, traders, and refugees wandered constantly. Each carried their own microbial hitchhikers and distributed them generously across the countryside. One person's mild illness became another person's tragedy. And then there were crowded institutions, places where dozens or hundreds of people shared close quarters. Monasteries, for example, were quiet, disciplined and disease factories. Soldiers in camps slept close, marched close, and ate close. Hospitals existed, but they weren't places to avoid illness. They were places where every illness gathered to socialize. Now add seasonal challenges, especially in winter. People kept windows shut to stay warm, trapping smoke, humidity, and stale air inside. They lived in close proximity for months. Viruses and bacteria thrived. A winter cold wasn't winter blues, it was a household crisis. 6 people sharing one bed meant 6 people sharing one infection. And with malnutrition, fatigue, and cold weakening the body, simple illnesses escalated fast. Fevers came regularly. Coughs lasted weeks. Boils, rashes, sores, and aches were accepted parts of existence. Many illnesses went unnamed because naming them didn't help anyone survive. Medieval people described sickness the way we describe weather: frequent, shifting, and unavoidable. But there were also large, terrifying outbreaks. long before the Black Death became the historical mascot of catastrophe. Plagues, fevers, fluxes, sweats, and great poxes swept through towns repeatedly. Entire villages were struck at once, with no one understanding why. People blamed outsiders, miasma, food, divine displeasure, or celestial alignment. Everything except the bacteria quietly thriving in water, food, or fleas. And because medieval people believed illness travelled through smell, they filled homes with fragrant herbs, burned incense, or wore pomanders filled with spices. It made the room smell nicer. It didn't do much else. Let's not forget infant mortality, which was heartbreakingly common. Most children didn't survive past age 5, not because medieval parents were careless, but because disease simply struck faster than the body could fight. A fever took hours to worsen. A cough turned deadly in days. A rash meant danger. Parents learned to accept uncertainty as a constant companion. Adults weren't safe either. A minor illness could become chronic. A cough might lead to pneumonia. A stomach infection could kill within days. An infected wound. A contaminated meal. A bad night's sleep. Anything could weaken the body enough for illness to take hold. Medical treatments didn't help. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, purging, vomiting, toxic ointments, and complicated rituals. These sometimes relieved symptoms, but often weakened the patient further. A sick person might recover despite the doctor, not because of the doctor. And yet, despite this constant danger, medieval people were remarkably resilient. They didn't collapse into despair every time someone sneezed. They understood sickness as part of life, part of the world, something to endure with stoicism, prayer, and a strong sense of community. Neighbours cared for each other. Families nursed the sick. Villagers offered prayers, food, or warm beds. Everyone suffered through illness together, because isolation wasn't possible. In medieval Europe, disease wasn't an event. It was an environment. It was the quiet, invisible participant in every meal, every gathering, every season, and every life. You didn't catch sickness. It simply arrived, sat down beside you, and stayed as long as it wanted. In medieval Europe, getting sick was bad, but seeking medical help could make the situation significantly worse. Treatments involved bloodletting, toxic substances, superstition, and pure guesswork. Healing was optional. The cure was confident. That didn't make it correct. To understand medieval medicine, you must begin with its foundation, the theory of humours. According to this ancient framework, the human body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health required perfect balance. Illness, that meant one humour had become too enthusiastic. So the cure wasn't about identifying germs or viruses. It was about guessing which bodily fluid was misbehaving and then doing something dramatic to fix it. And dramatic is the polite word. Bloodletting, the medieval favourite. Bloodletting was the superstar of medieval treatments. Fever, remove blood. Headache, remove more blood. Stomachache, rash, bad dreams, tooth pain, general disappointment. Take blood immediately. Doctors used knives or leeches depending on the patient's status and their own mood. Leeches were considered gentler, but they were messy. Knives were efficient but terrifying. Bleeding could continue for minutes, sometimes hours, depending on the doctor's enthusiasm and the patient's ability to remain conscious. People fainted. People weakened. People died, not from illness, but from medical determination. And the best part? The worse the illness, the more blood doctors recommended removing. You could be dangerously weak, but the logic was simple. If the patient collapses, clearly the humour was powerful. Purgatives and vomiting, bring a bucket. If doctors weren't draining your fluids, they were encouraging them to leave on their own. Purgatives were substances designed to make you vomit or expel everything from the other end. Substances included strong herbs, salt water, laxative plants, metallic compounds. or mixtures so questionable even medieval people hesitated. A typical medieval prescription could do more damage to the digestive system than the illness ever intended. Patients spent days violently emptying their bodies while healers nodded approvingly. If the patient survived, the treatment was considered a success. If not, well, people died all the time. Medicine wasn't expected to perform miracles. Herbal medicine, helpful or horrifying. Herbal remedies varied wildly. Some were genuinely effective thanks to centuries of observation. But many prescriptions included plants that were mildly toxic, plants that were extremely toxic, plants that did something. The doctor just didn't know what combinations of herbs that reacted badly together. It wasn't unusual to drink a medicinal brew that numbed pain while slowly poisoning your liver. Some healers suggested carrying herbs in pockets or tying them to clothing. This didn't help the illness, but made you smell like a mobile garden, which improved morale. Surgery, a last resort. For good reason. Medieval surgery existed, but it was practiced in an era without anesthesia, hygiene, or pain relief stronger than wine. Barbers who cut hair and sharpened razors also performed minor surgeries. Their tools were clean enough to cut hair, and that was the standard. Typical operations included lancing boils, setting fractures, removing infected tissue amputations, rare but feared. Surgical outcomes depended on the surgeon's skill, the patient's constitution, and the will of the cosmic forces. The operating table was often a bench, a table, or the floor. Instruments were wiped on cloth, not sterilized. Patients were held down by family members or neighbors. Screaming was normal. Passing out was convenient. Surgery didn't just risk infection, it practically guaranteed it. But sometimes infection was already so advanced that the risky surgery offered a faint chance of survival. In those cases, people prayed first. Always. Doctors versus folk healers, a medieval rivalry. Physicians were educated, expensive, and often inaccurate. Folk healers were uneducated, affordable, and sometimes surprisingly effective, mostly because they used common sense and observation instead of ancient texts. Doctors diagnosed illness by checking the color of urine, the smell of breath, the position of stars, the balance of humors, the patient's horoscope vibes. Folk healers diagnosed based on what the patient ate, where they worked, who else was sick. Physical symptoms, guess which method helped more. Still, folk remedies weren't perfect. Some were benign, but some included practices that would make modern people reconsider humanity. Burning herbs near the face of a feverish patient, burying objects in the yard, chanting prayers, or placing charms under pillows were all considered standard care. Cures based on hope, not logic. Medieval medicine also included treatments such as drinking powdered pearls, wearing gemstones to balance humors, placing sacred relics on wounds, sitting near a holy shrine, whispering secrets into a hole in a tree. Touching the hand of a king, royal touch was believed to cure disease. None of these worked, obviously, but they provided comfort, and in a world with little real understanding, comfort mattered. The patient experience. Imagine being ill in medieval Europe. Your fever rises. Your doctor arrives with knives and leeches. Your healer offers herbs that might cure or poison. Your neighbor brings charms, just in case. Your priest arrives to check on your soul. Your family tries not to panic out loud. Every treatment hoped you would get better. None guaranteed it. Why people trusted these methods? Because sometimes people recovered despite the treatment, not because of it. When they did, the cure received the credit. When they didn't, the illness was blamed. It was a perfect loop of medical confidence and medical confusion. In medieval Europe, medical help was an adventure, an unpredictable gamble, a bold experiment performed on your unwilling body. The cure was confident. That didn't make it correct. In medieval Europe, danger didn't always arrive with swords, plagues, or charging livestock. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest, most absurd form imaginable. A scrape, a blister, a splinter, a stubbed toe. A minor cut could fester, infect, and kill you. There were no antibiotics, only hope and prayer. Paper cuts had long-term ambitions. To understand why tiny injuries were so deadly, we must start with the medieval body, specifically what constantly threatened it. Daily life involved manual work, rough surfaces, sharp tools, unpredictable animals, dirty environments, and absolutely no protective gear. Hands cracked from cold, feet blistered from walking, and knees scraped from falls. Every day produced new scratches, cuts, and bruises. No one lived unscathed. But what transformed these injuries from inconveniences into ticking time bombs was the medieval world's relationship with filth. Dirt was everywhere, on tools, clothing, bedding, and hands. You couldn't avoid it. Even when you washed, when you did wash, the water might not actually make you cleaner. Wounds were exposed to soil, animal waste, decaying matter, and bacteria long before anyone knew bacteria existed. A cut wasn't a minor issue. It was an open invitation for every microorganism within miles. Let's take a simple example, a splinter. Today you remove one with sterilized tweezers and move on. In the medieval world, splinters were larger, rougher, and harder to remove. If it broke off under the skin, you lived with it. Then it swelled, then it reddened, then it oozed. Infection set in, fever followed. If the infection spread, known as blood poisoning, you had mere days unless the body miraculously rallied. A splinter wasn't a minor injury, it was an exit strategy. Or consider blisters, which medieval shoes produced with astonishing efficiency. Boots were stiff, poorly fitted, and often reused for years. A blister rubbed open, exposed raw skin, collected dirt, and became infected. For labourers who walked or worked daily, stopping to let a blister heal was not an option. Infection spread silently, steadily, without mercy. Then there were cuts from tools, which were rarely sharp enough to slice cleanly. Instead, injuries were jagged, crushed, and full of debris. A blow from a dull knife or misaimed axe didn't create neat incisions, it tore flesh. Torn flesh invited bacteria, and bacteria accepted the invitation every time. Because there were no antibiotics, treatment relied on whatever was available. Herbal poultices, sometimes helpful, sometimes horrifying, wine or vinegar, if available, cauterization, painful but occasionally effective prayers, always free of charge. But most minor injuries weren't treated at all, either because people didn't recognize the danger or because the injury seemed too small to warrant attention. Medieval people were tough out of necessity. They didn't fuss over small cuts. They kept working. They didn't rest. They didn't bandage properly. By the time swelling or fever appeared, the infection was well underway. Even the simplest wound could escalate into abscesses, painful pockets of pus that needed lancing gangrene, where tissue died slowly and visibly septicemia, when infection entered the bloodstream erysipelas, a skin infection that spread rapidly and painfully lockjaw, from tetanus lurking in the soil. These weren't rare complications. They were common. Let's talk about burns, a constant threat in a world filled with open flames. Touching a hot pot, dropping boiling soup, brushing against a hearth, or even cooking could leave burns that blistered, tore, and festered. Burns heal slowly even today. In medieval Europe, they often healed incorrectly or not at all. Infection almost always followed. A burn across the hand could permanently disable a person. A burn across the arm or torso could kill them. Then there were injuries caused by falls, and there were many. Uneven streets, slippery mud, loose stones, unstable stairs, dim interiors, and nighttime darkness turned walking into a hazard. A fall that bruised the knee or scraped the arm seemed insignificant. But the scrape became dirty, the bruise swelled, mobility decreased, work became difficult, weakness set in, infection found an opening. Even animal scratches were dangerous. Cats carried bacteria, dogs carried bacteria, chickens left marks that dirt quickly infected, livestock stepped on feet, causing crushing injuries that swelled and never healed properly. A single bite from a rat dog, or even goose, could introduce infection deep into the skin. Women faced injuries from domestic work, knife slips, spinning wheel pricks, or burns from tending the hearth. Men handling tools, timber, or metal were constantly cut or bruised. Children scraped knees daily and had no chance of keeping them clean. No medieval family had a member who wasn't dealing with at least one wound at any given time. And then there was the problem of treatment quality. A healed wound didn't necessarily mean healed well. Scar tissue tightened limbs, joints stiffened. Small injuries led to long-term disabilities. A minor hand injury could leave a person unable to work, plunging them into poverty. A cut foot could mean immobility. A deeper wound could mean lifelong pain. Without proper care, infected injuries sometimes ruptured internally. People described sudden chills, spreading pain, or a red line moving up the limb, classic symptoms of septicemia. They called it the poison rising. There was no cure. Once infection reached the bloodstream, death was almost certain. Community healers did their best. Some remedies worked surprisingly well. Honey, for example, was used occasionally and has antibacterial properties. But these successes were inconsistent. Most treatments were chosen by tradition, not science. And yet medieval people persisted. They bandaged with clean cloth if they had it. They used herbs that soothed pain. They avoided strenuous work when they could, rarely. They prayed, hoped, endured, and accepted. Injury was part of life, and death was never far from it. In medieval Europe, danger didn't always roar. Sometimes it nicked you. Sometimes it scraped you. Sometimes it poked you while you chopped firewood. A tiny wound could start a chain reaction that ended a life. And every scratch carried the same silent message. Take me seriously. I have ambitions. In medieval Europe, childbirth wasn't a rite of passage. It was a gamble. Every pregnancy carried the silent question, will both mother and child survive this? For women, survival odds dropped dramatically during pregnancy and labour. It was expected, feared, and often fatal. Bringing life into the world came with a receipt. Let's begin with a simple truth. Medieval women gave birth many times. Not once or twice over the course of a carefully planned life, but as many times as their bodies could manage, often 10 or more. With no reliable contraception and constant cultural pressure to produce children, especially sons, pregnancy was nearly continuous. Each birth weakened the body, drained nutrients, and raised the odds of complications. By their mid-20s, many women had already given birth multiple times and suffered the accumulated physical toll of it. But pregnancy was only the beginning of the danger. From the moment a woman knew she was expecting, fear entered her life. Miscarriage was common. Early pregnancies often ended with bleeding, cramps, infection, or unknown complications. There were no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, no doctors specializing in pregnancy. A woman simply hoped for the best and prayed, prayer being the only consistent form of prenatal care. If she made it to late pregnancy, new risks emerged. Babies could turn incorrectly. They could grow too large for the mother's pelvis. They could die in utero, creating life-threatening infections. Premature labour was often fatal for the infant, sometimes for the mother as well. And these dangers were invisible until the moment they occurred. Medieval women didn't receive warnings, they received emergencies. Then came labour, a process medieval texts described with equal parts reverence and terror. Childbirth happened at home, attended by local midwives, friends, or older women who had experience. But experience wasn't the same as medical training. Midwives could be skilled, but their knowledge was based on practice, not anatomy. When things went wrong, their tools were limited to herbs, prayers, cloth, and instinct. Labour could last hours or days. Exhaustion set in. Dehydration followed. Women fainted, screamed, lost consciousness or entered shock, and there was no pain relief beyond whatever herbs the midwife could brew, usually mild sedatives or calming teas. Forget anesthesia, forget epidurals, forget anything resembling comfort. Women endured childbirth with nothing but courage and the collective support of other women who had endured it before. And complications. They were horrifying. Obstructed labour, when the baby couldn't pass through the birth canal, was one of the most feared. In such cases, both mother and child were trapped in a deadly stalemate. Without surgical intervention, and medieval Europe lacked safe caesarean sections, there was often no escape. Women died slowly, painfully, and helplessly. Even when the baby arrived safely, danger persisted. Postpartum hemorrhage was common and nearly always fatal. A woman could bleed internally or externally, weakening rapidly as everyone watched with dread, knowing there was nothing they could do. Bloodletting, the medieval response to nearly everything, was, thankfully, not applied here, but the absence of useful treatments was no less deadly. Then came infection, the cruel thief of new motherhood. Medieval people didn't know about sterile environments. Midwives washed their hands. Sometimes. Tools weren't sterilized. Bedding wasn't cleaned. The birthing chamber itself was warm, crowded, and ripe with bacteria. Childbed fever, now understood as postpartum infection, ravaged women days after giving birth. It began with chills, then fever, then agonizing pain, and finally death. Entire communities recognized its patterns, but no one knew how to stop it. A new mother might survive pregnancy and survive labor, only to die a week later while holding her newborn. And these risks weren't rare. Death in childbirth was one of the leading causes of mortality among medieval women. Almost every family had lost someone this way. Grandmothers whispered warnings. Mothers prayed daily. Husbands held their breath. Children watched siblings be born and mothers disappear. The tragedy didn't end there. Infants faced their own perilous odds. Without sanitation, clean water, or medical care, infants died from fever, dehydration, respiratory infections, digestive illnesses, congenital issues, malnutrition, random accidents. Many mothers didn't live to raise the children they birthed. Many infants didn't live to know the mothers who died bringing them into the world. Childbirth, for all its pain and danger, was also deeply communal. Women gave birth surrounded by other women, midwives, neighbours, sisters, mothers. This created a bond that transcended social class. A noblewoman and a peasant both feared childbirth. They both risked their lives. They both placed their trust in human hands and divine mercy. Birth was one of the rare medieval experiences where status meant very little. Death made no distinctions. Men didn't often attend the birth chamber. The birthing room was considered a female domain, part sacred, part terrifying. Husbands waited outside, listening to screams or sudden silence, both of which signaled danger. Some paced, some prayed. Some prepared for either celebration or grief. Beyond the physical risks, childbirth reshaped a woman's life. Surviving labour didn't mean returning to strength quickly. Without rest or nutrition, recovery was slow and incomplete. Many women suffered chronic pain, prolapse, incontinence, or long-term injuries from difficult births. But the medieval world didn't pause for healing. Mothers returned to work within days, cooking, cleaning, tending fields, caring for children. Their bodies belonged to survival, not recovery. And yet medieval women were astonishingly resilient. They faced danger daily, endured it, survived it, and did so with strength modern society often underestimates. Their courage wasn't celebrated with monuments or medals. It was acknowledged quietly, passed from generation to generation through whispered stories and shared experience. Childbirth in medieval Europe was bravery performed behind closed doors, a risk every woman faced, a fear every family carried. a miracle every time both mother and child lived to see the morning. Bringing life into the world came with a receipt, and the cost was often everything a woman had to give. In medieval Europe, childhood wasn't a protected stage of life filled with toys, supervised playdates, and enrichment activities. Childhood was a high-risk experiment with survival. Children worked early, played around hazards, and died often. Survival to adulthood was an achievement. Childhood didn't have milestones. It had odds. Let's begin with the most striking difference between medieval childhood and modern childhood. Children were considered useful as soon as they could walk straight without falling into the fire. Toddlerhood was brief. By age 4 or 5, children were expected to contribute to the household in whatever way their size allowed. There were no lazy years, no early childhood education programs, no school readiness routines. If you could carry something, you carried it. If you could scare birds off the crops, you did. If you could fetch water, gather firewood, stir a pot, or watch a younger sibling, congratulations. You were now a functioning member of society. And the tasks given to children weren't sanitized versions of adult chores. They were adult chores done with small hands. A 6-year-old might herd geese or sheep along muddy roads. A 7-year-old might help in the fields pulling weeds, stepping between tools sharp enough to injure adults. An 8-year-old might run errands across town unsupervised, dodging carts, animals, and hazards. 9-year-olds hauled buckets of water heavy enough to strain their backs. Childhood was physical, constant, and unforgiving. Then there was the lack of supervision, because medieval adults were busy surviving themselves. Parents weren't absent out of neglect. They were absent because life demanded it. Fields needed tending. Livestock needed care. Firewood needed chopping. Food needed preparing. Distance and labor pulled adults away from home daily, leaving children to navigate danger on their own. Siblings raised siblings. Older children raised younger children. Toddlers followed everyone around like small, determined shadows. With all this independence came an environment full of hazards. Children played and worked around. Open fires, boiling pots, sharp tools, unclean water, unstable structures, animals with unpredictable tempers, streets full of mud, waste, and carts, ponds and wells without barriers, steep ladders in barns, crumbling walls, slippery floors. No one child-proofed anything. The idea of safety locks, baby gates, or outlet covers would have sounded like satire. Children didn't have toys as we know them. They had sticks, stones, bones, leather scraps, and anything lying around. Games were improvised and often involved running, climbing, wrestling, and throwing things, sometimes at each other. Accidentally getting hit with a rock was considered part of social development. But even when playing safely, children faced constant health risks. Their immune systems battled the same diseases adults did, but with less experience and weaker resilience. Childhood illnesses like measles, smallpox, dysentery, and fevers swept through communities regularly. Some children survived, many did not. Infant and child mortality rates were astonishingly high. In some regions, fewer than half of children lived to age 10. Even minor injuries became major threats. A cut from a rusty nail, a bite from a dog, a tumble from a height, or a burn from the hearth could turn deadly. Children healed slowly if malnourished, and most were. Growing bodies needed calories medieval diets struggled to provide. Then came the dangers specific to children's work. Herding, for example, wasn't a calm pastoral hobby. Children had to control animals larger than they were, fend off predators, and keep the herd away from other properties. A frightened cow could crush a child. A territorial goose could injure one. A stray wolf or dog could attack. Field work was no safer. Children walked barefoot or in flimsy shoes over uneven ground full of hazards. They carried tools too large for their hands. They inhaled dust, pollen, and smoke constantly. Heat stroke and exhaustion claimed young lives in harvest seasons. Water gathering was notoriously dangerous. Wells were deep, slippery, and unguarded. Falling in meant drowning, and it happened often. Rivers had treacherous currents. Ponds looked peaceful but hid sudden drop-offs. Children collected water anyway because families needed it. And for children in towns and cities, there was the added peril of urban life. Crowded streets meant potential trampling by carts, collisions with animals, or stepping into contaminated drains. Markets were noisy and chaotic. Workshops forged metal, boiled substances, and carved wood, none of which was safe for wandering children. Even education, where it existed, came with risks. Boys attending schools could face strict discipline, corporal punishment, overcrowded rooms, long cold walks, illnesses spread among pupils. Girls rarely attended formal school, instead learning domestic skills that came with their own dangers: cutting, boiling, lifting, spinning. Poor families often sent children to work as servants or apprentices. While these roles offered food and shelter, they also introduced new dangers: strict masters, heavy labour, and unfamiliar environments. But for all these dangers, medieval children were not passive victims of a harsh world. They were adaptable, clever, and resilient. They developed survival skills early. They learned how to avoid dangerous animals, how to navigate streets, how to keep fires under control, how to help during emergencies, and how to endure hardship without complaint. Childhood wasn't sentimentalized, it was training for adulthood. Medieval communities also understood the value of children socially and emotionally. They played together, laughed together, shared simple joys, and formed tight bonds within their villages or neighborhoods. Festivals, games, and seasonal celebrations gave them moments of genuine delight. Their lives were hard but not joyless. Still, the harsh truth remained. Childhood in medieval Europe was a trial by fire. Some children passed, many did not. To become an adult was not only a biological achievement, it was a statistical victory. In a world filled with danger, a medieval child didn't celebrate a birthday with candles. They celebrated by still being alive. Medieval Europe did not believe in ergonomic workplaces, safety regulations, or work-life balance. Work wasn't just physically demanding, it was physically consuming. Manual labour broke bodies quickly. Injuries were permanent, rest was rare, and exhaustion was normal. Your body wasn't a machine, it was a consumable. To understand the relentless brutality of medieval labour, imagine waking before dawn not because an alarm clock rang, but because the cold, the animals, or the urgency of survival demanded it. Work began early, ended late, and filled every space in between. There were no weekends, no vacations, no sick days, and certainly no retirement. If you could stand, you worked. If you couldn't stand, you tried anyway. Peasant labour, the backbone and breaking point. For peasants, the majority of the population, daily labour meant the fields. Farming was not gentle pastoral scenery. It was bending, lifting, hauling, digging, ploughing, planting, weeding, and harvesting. Every task involved repetitive motion, strain, and risk. Ploughing required controlling large animals, manoeuvring heavy wooden ploughs, and wrestling with uneven soil. A slip could jam your foot under the beam or pull muscles in your back that never healed properly. Sowing demanded hours of stooping and walking. Harvesting meant swinging sharp tools in motion after motion, often while unsteady or exhausted. Weather didn't cooperate. Heat baked workers until their clothing stuck painfully to their skin. Cold numbed fingers until they cracked open. Rain turned fields into mud pits that clung to boots and slowed every step. Wind stung eyes and dried out hands. Nature did not assist labour, it challenged it. Even something as simple as lifting a sack of grain could strain a shoulder or tear a ligament. Without proper medical knowledge, these injuries became lifelong limitations. A ruined wrist, a damaged back, or a weakened knee didn't stop work. It just made every task more painful. Craft labour. Skilled but still dangerous. For artisans, work required both precision and endurance. Blacksmiths swung hammers hard enough to bend metal, their arms vibrating from impact thousands of times per week. Sparks flew, hot iron threatened burns, heavy anvils strained backs. The smithy was a workplace where injuries were normal and hearing loss was practically guaranteed. Carpenters hauled timber, climbed scaffolding, and worked with axes and saws sharp enough to take off fingers. One misjudged cut could end a career, or a life. Masons hauled stones the size of modern refrigerators, slung them into place, and chipped at them for hours. They climbed precarious scaffolds built from wood that creaked ominously. Dust filled their lungs. Back injuries were almost mandatory. Weavers and spinners worked indoors but weren't safe either. Hours of repetitive motion strained shoulders, necks, and hands. Eyes suffered from poor lighting. Wool dust clogged nostrils. Loom accidents, yes, loom accidents, happened often enough to be feared. Leather workers inhaled fumes from tanning solutions strong enough to wilt plants. Bakers stood near blazing ovens for hours. Millers risked being crushed by grinding gears or caught in machinery. No job was gentle, not even the ones without heavy equipment. Women's labour, endless, invisible. Essential women worked constantly, and their work was rarely recognised as labour, even though it consumed their bodies just as brutally. They fetched water multiple times a day from distant wells or rivers, carrying heavy buckets that strained shoulders and backs. They prepared food using grinding stones, beating dough, hauling firewood, tending fires, stirring heavy pots, and lifting boiling liquids that could burn them instantly. Laundry involved scrubbing clothing on boards, boiling linens in cauldrons, and hauling wet fabric that weighed twice as much as dry. Cleaning meant sweeping floors that were basically mud plus whatever life threw onto them. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were never-ending tasks. And on top of all this, women cared for children, nursed the sick, and managed the household. There was no pause, no idle time. No day off. Exhaustion was simply the default setting. Urban labour. Crowded, noisy and hazardous cities introduced different dangers. Market porters hauled crates and barrels through narrow streets packed with people. Tanners waded in pits of urine and chemicals. Dyers inhaled fumes from boiled dyes. Metalworkers hammered day and night in workshops thick with smoke. Sailors loaded and unloaded ships with ropes that snapped, weights that shifted, and docks that were slippery death traps. Apprentices worked long hours doing the worst jobs in the workshop, cleaning, hauling, fetching, and enduring beatings from masters who believed discipline and violence were synonyms. Exhaustion as a daily reality. Medieval people lived with chronic fatigue. Most slept poorly in smoky, cramped houses. They woke early and worked immediately. Meals were small and repetitive, offering just enough fuel to keep going but not enough to restore energy. Even children felt the weight of exhaustion, performing chores and labour beyond their age. Fatigue wasn't a symptom of overwork. It was a permanent state of being, and exhaustion weakened the body, making injuries more likely. A tired hand slipped. A tired foot misjudged a step. A tired arm couldn't lift properly. Every action carried risk. Permanent injuries. The price of survival. A pulled muscle rarely healed right. A fractured bone might set crookedly. A cut might leave nerve damage. A burned hand might stiffen. A knee twisted during harvest season might swell every winter thereafter. These permanent injuries didn't end work. They made it harder, slower, and more painful. People limped, winced, clenched teeth, and continued. There was no alternative. Survival required productivity. Why people endured it? Because they had no choice. Because rest was a luxury. Because work meant life. Because stopping meant hunger, debt, or disgrace. And because medieval culture valued endurance as a virtue, complaining achieved nothing. Completing the task, no matter the pain, was the expectation. Medieval work didn't just use the human body, it consumed it, piece by piece, muscle by muscle, year by year. Your body wasn't a machine, it was a consumable, one the medieval world used until it couldn't anymore. In medieval Europe, tools were essential for survival, but they weren't designed with your safety, comfort, or long-term well-being in mind. Tools did not care about your fingers, your limbs, or your hopes of making it to the end of the day uninjured. Axes, knives, looms, and ploughs injured regularly. Safety standards didn't exist. The tool worked. You were optional. Let's begin with the most iconic medieval tool, the axe. Axes harvested firewood, shaped timber, butchered livestock, and occasionally settled disputes in ways neither party preferred. But medieval axes were heavy, uneven, and prone to slipping if the handle was worn, splintered, or damp, which they almost always were. Swinging an axe was a commitment. One wrong angle and the blade glanced off the wood and straight toward your shin. Miss the target entirely. That was your foot's problem. Overexert yourself? The axe came down harder than intended, possibly embedding itself in the ground or, if luck was truly terrible, in your own hand. A day of chopping wood could easily end with bandages, regret, and a new respect for the fragility of legs. Knives were no kinder. Medieval knives weren't delicate kitchen tools. They were all-purpose blades used for eating, carving, skinning, cutting rope, trimming wood, preparing food, and self-defense. They were sharp when first made, but dulled quickly, resulting in more force needed with every cut. A dull knife is a dangerous knife, especially when held by someone tired, hungry, and rushing through chores before sunset. Then there were saws, which medieval carpenters wielded with bare hands and prayers. They weren't precise instruments. Teeth were uneven, blades wobbled, handles split. A saw slipping from the cut path meant your hand, or your helper's hand, was suddenly the new target. Many a medieval craftsman had scars or missing fingers from saw-related betrayals. But some of the most dangerous tools weren't the sharpest ones. They were the heavy ones. Take the plough, for example. Medieval ploughs were not sleek iron machines. They were wooden contraptions dragged by animals that didn't always agree with the concept of straight lines. If an ox stumbled, the plough jerked violently. If the plough hit a root or stone, it stopped suddenly, while you kept moving. Plenty of farmers slammed into plough handles hard enough to crack ribs or knock out teeth, and plough blades were sharp enough to slice flesh if you tried to fix or adjust the tool mid-work. Fields were full of hazards, hidden stones, uneven earth, mud patches that sucked your feet in, and roots tough enough to twist the plough violently. A day at the plough was a gamble, and the plough didn't care which side you landed on. Hammers were no safer. Medieval hammers were used for everything from forging to construction, but balance wasn't a design priority. A misstrike could smash your thumb, flatten your fingernail, or bounce into your face. Blacksmiths risked eye injuries from flying metal flakes, and carpenters risked splinters driven deep into hands. Gloves were rare and usually too expensive for common people. You used your bare hands and trusted fate. Yet some of the most deceptively dangerous tools belonged to the world of textiles, specifically looms and spinning wheels. Cloth had to be made somewhere, and the process was grueling. Looms were large, wooden, full of moving parts, and absolutely capable of breaking fingers. Shuttle launchers could strike hands at high speed. Threads snapped violently. Missteps caught clothing in gears. Weavers developed chronic injuries from repetitive motion, strained shoulders, and back pain from hours hunched over their work. Spinning wheels had fast-moving spindles ready to jab anyone who got too close. Children helping with spinning often pricked fingers repeatedly, opening tiny wounds that, given medieval hygiene, could get infected. Even making clothing carried physical risk. Metalworking tools were their own category of hazard. Tongs, files, chisels, and adzes were sharp, heavy, and used near hot metal. A slip could burn, cut, or crush in the same moment. Sparks flew freely. Hammers rang loudly enough to damage hearing long before anyone understood what hearing damage meant. For bakers, the tool that posed the greatest risk was the oven peel, a long wooden paddle used to place bread deep inside a blazing oven. The oven itself could scorch exposed skin instantly. The peel was unwieldy, and one misjudged movement brought your arms dangerously close to burning walls. Even simpler tools like hoes, forks, and scythes had the potential to ruin a day. Scythes were notoriously unforgiving. A scythe blade was long, thin, slightly curved, and sharpened to lethal efficiency. Misjudging a swing could injure co-workers or oneself. A slip in wet grass could send the blade into a leg. Farmers used scythes daily, often in groups, moving in synchronized patterns. One person's mistake could injure everyone. Let's not forget the tools used to manage animals. Pitchforks, ropes, halters, and branding irons all posed risks. A tangled rope could pull tight around a limb. A pitchfork dropped accidentally might land in the worst possible place. A branding iron was unforgivingly hot, and even the slightest miscalculation meant burns. Then there were tools used in mills and workshops powered by water wheels or animals. These workshops contained large grinding stones, wooden gears, and spinning shafts. Clothing could get caught. Fingers could be crushed. Limbs could be trapped. Mill accidents were gruesome, and since machinery didn't immediately stop, injuries quickly escalated. Tools didn't only injure, they disabled. A single accident could ruin the ability to work forever. Losing a thumb, damaging a wrist, or breaking an arm meant the difference between a productive adult and someone suddenly dependent on family, charity, or sheer luck. Despite constant danger, medieval people continued using these tools daily because they had no choice. Survival depended on them. A damaged roof? Fix it. Broken cart? Repair it. Harvest season? Swing that scythe. Whether you feared the tools didn't matter, your livelihood required you to put your hands on them. There was no safety training, no guards over blades, no helmets, no gloves, no warning labels. No one told you to lift with your legs. Tools were made to do one thing: work. If using them hurt you, that was considered user error, not a design flaw. Medieval tools functioned perfectly, as long as you didn't expect them to care about you. The tool worked. You were optional. Crime in medieval Europe didn't unfold like a courtroom drama. It was more like a lightning strike. Quick, shocking, and usually painful. Theft, assault, and violence were common, and justice was swift and severe. Law enforcement skipped the paperwork and went straight to punishment. To understand why medieval justice was so brutal, you first must understand the environment. Communities were small, resources were scarce, people lived on the edge of survival. A stolen chicken didn't just inconvenience a family, it meant one fewer meal, one less source of eggs, and one more reason to panic about the coming winter. Theft wasn't petty, it was existential. And because everyday life lacked modern policing, local justice had to be direct. Medieval Europe had no investigative teams, no crime labs, no forensic analysis, and definitely no "you have the right to remain silent." What you had instead were angry neighbours, watchmen with torches, lords with tempers, and village juries who wanted the whole situation resolved before lunch. If you were accused of a crime, the process was fast. Whether or not it was fair was a completely separate issue, usually answered with "not really." Crime was everywhere, because opportunity was everywhere. Medieval life created natural pockets of crime. Markets were crowded, noisy, and full of opportunists. Pickpockets cut purses with knives so sharp you didn't feel the theft until you reached for your money. Roads and forests hosted bandits who waited for travellers burdened with goods, often attacking in groups. Many bandits were former soldiers, trained, desperate, and highly motivated. Towns at night were poorly lit labyrinths. Darkness turned every corner into an invitation for trouble. Strangers were suspicious by default. If someone you didn't know approached you after sundown, it was wise to assume they weren't asking for directions, and the danger didn't stop at theft. Drunken brawls erupted constantly. Fights broke out over land, animals, insults, spilled ale, or simply the fact that two people disliked each other's faces. Knives were common, tempers were short, weapons were always at hand. What passed for law enforcement medieval policing was not a professional system. It consisted of local watchmen who patrolled with lanterns and sticks, village constables who volunteered or were appointed, townsfolk who formed spontaneous mobs whenever someone yelled thief, and lords bailiffs who handled serious matters by enforcing harsh punishments rather than maintaining order. Most crimes were pursued not by authorities, but by the victim and their family. If someone stole from you, you chased them. If someone injured you, you called the neighbours to help catch them. Justice worked best when shouted angrily and performed by consensus. If a criminal fled into the woods, pursuit continued until A. he was caught, B. the pursuers got tired, C. night fell and no one wanted to be eaten by wolves. There was no long-term investigation. The system simply didn't have the resources, nor the patience for that. Justice was public, immediate, and meant to teach a lesson. The medieval justice system had one main philosophy: make an example of the offender so nobody else tries it. Punishments varied by place and time, but the general categories included 1. Fines. This was the best possible outcome. If you could pay, you escaped with your body mostly intact. But for the poor, fines might mean losing livestock or tools, devastating in its own way. 2. Stocks and pillories. Public humiliation wasn't a light punishment, it was an ordeal. You were locked into wooden frames for hours or days. People threw rotten eggs, mud, stones, or insults. Weather battered you. Animals harassed you. Children poked you with sticks. The goal wasn't just humiliation, it was physical suffering wrapped in communal entertainment. 3. Whippings were common, brutal, and delivered publicly. A criminal might be tied to a post and lashed until skin tore. There was no medical care afterward. Infections were a very real risk. 4. Branding. Repeat offenders sometimes had symbols burned into their skin, marks of shame that followed them for life. It was both punishment and public warning. 5. Mutilation. Serious theft or repeated crimes could result in losing a hand, fingers, ears, or nose. The idea was simple. If you misuse a body part, you don't get to keep it. Not ideal for rehabilitation, but extremely effective at sending a message. 6. Execution reserved for major crimes: murder, treason, arson, or highway robbery. Hanging was most common, but other methods existed depending on region and era. None of them gentle. Even trial procedures weren't built for fairness. Trials were a loose term. Trial might involve neighbours giving opinions, he always seemed suspicious, witnesses offering unreliable accounts, the accused swearing an oath, while hoping God didn't smite them for lying, and occasionally tests known as ordeals. The infamous trial by ordeal involved tasks like holding a hot iron, retrieving a stone from boiling water, or being bound and thrown into a river to see if you floated. If your wounds healed cleanly or you sank and were rescued fast enough, you were innocent. If not, sorry. Justice wasn't blind, it was confused and improvised. Why crime was treated so harshly? Because preventative policing didn't exist. Because prisons were expensive to maintain. Because communities couldn't afford repeat offenders. Because fear was an effective deterrent. And because in a world where survival was already a daily struggle, a single crime could destabilize an entire household. Crime was dangerous. For everyone, being a criminal was risky. Being accused of crime was risky. Being near a crime was risky. If a brawl broke out in a tavern, innocent bystanders often received the same punishments as the fighters. Shouting distance counted as involvement. Living in medieval Europe meant understanding one thing clearly. Justice moved fast, hit hard, and didn't apologize. The law didn't knock politely. It didn't investigate thoroughly. It didn't negotiate gently. Law enforcement skipped the paperwork and went straight to punishment. In medieval Europe, punishment wasn't just a legal matter, it was a spectacle. Executions, mutilations, and public shaming were everyday sights. Violence was normalized, expected, and woven into the fabric of community life. Entertainment came with moral lessons and screaming. To understand why punishments were so public, we must first understand the medieval worldview. Communities were small, crime prevention was weak, and law enforcement was inconsistent at best. The justice system relied on fear and visibility. The idea was simple. If everyone saw what happened to lawbreakers, no one would dare to follow in their footsteps. Public punishment wasn't an option. It was the foundation of deterrence. Punishment as performance executions were treated like events, sometimes solemn, sometimes rowdy, but always public. Notices spread quickly. A hanging tomorrow, a beheading at noon, a thief in the stocks this afternoon. People gathered from miles around. Children came. Merchants paused their work. Peddlers sold snacks. Priests hovered nearby. The crowd treated it as a mixture of civic duty, moral education, and entertainment. And there were many forms of punishment. Each one sent a message. The stocks and pillory, humiliation on display. Humiliation was one of the most common punishments for lesser crimes. Stocks restrained legs. Pillories trapped the head and hands. Offenders stood in these devices for hours or days, while the public expressed its opinion loudly and physically. People threw rotten vegetables, mud, manure, insults, stones, and anything else that sent a message. This wasn't a private embarrassment. It was communal. The entire town participated in reinforcing the moral order. If you stole bread, insulted your neighbor, or broke local rules, you were displayed like a lesson in human form, and the longer you stood there, the more lessons the community felt obligated to teach. For children, witnessing this created a lifelong understanding. The law didn't whisper, it shouted. Whippings and floggings, pain as instruction. Whipping posts stood in town squares near markets or outside churches. A criminal, tied securely, received lashes with a whip or rod. The number varied, sometimes 10, sometimes 50, sometimes until the officer grows tired. The punishment was public bloody humiliating, and often disfiguring crowds watched as stripes formed across backs and legs. The sound of whipping was familiar. Children imitated it in games. People rarely looked away. They'd seen it before and would see it again. Branding and mutilation, marked for life. Repeat offenders or those guilty of serious crimes faced branding. Hot irons pressed into flesh to mark someone visibly and permanently as a criminal. Letters were used. T for thief, for example. Branded individuals carried their punishment forever. It wasn't just physical pain, it was social exile. Mutilation was also common. Fingers removed for theft, ears cropped for repeated offences, noses cut for adultery or slander in some regions, hands severed for violent crimes. These weren't random choices. They were symbolic punishments meant to reflect the crime. If your hand stole, your hands paid. If your mouth lied or insulted, your mouth suffered. And since these punishments were public, they taught everyone watching exactly what behaviour the community condemned. Executions, the ultimate spectacle. For crimes, the law considered unforgivable: murder, treason, arson, and highway robbery. Execution awaited. Hanging was the most common method. Gallows often stood on hills, crossroads, or just outside town gates, places where bodies could be seen by everyone passing through. But hanging wasn't the only method. Depending on the region and severity of the crime, executions could include beheading, considered more honourable, but far from quick if the executioner lacked skill burning, used for heresy or witchcraft accusations breaking on the wheel, in some regions, which involved crude and prolonged suffering drowning, occasionally used for women convicted of severe crimes. Crowds gathered for these events not only to witness justice, but also to reaffirm the social order. Execution days were grimly festive. Vendors sold drinks, people climbed onto carts for better views, children were lifted onto shoulders to learn right from wrong. The condemned might give last words, confess, curse, or stay silent. And after the execution, bodies sometimes remained displayed as warnings. Hanging bodies could stay for days, weeks, or months. Depending on local custom, heads might be placed on spikes. Criminals were used as signposts, literally, telling travellers what happened to wrongdoers here. Shaming rituals, moral theatre. Not all punishments were violent, but even the mild ones were traumatic. Shaming rituals included parading offenders through town, forcing them to wear ridiculous costumes, making them confess aloud in church, tying them to church doors, dunking them in water, the ducking stool for disorderly conduct, or simply having neighbours chant insults as they passed. These rituals reinforced community values, while ensuring that offenders felt exposed, vulnerable, and ostracised. Public shame wasn't a single event. It was a social stain that lasted long after the punishment ended. Why medieval punishment was so brutal? Several reasons shaped this harsh system. 1. Lack of prisons. Long-term incarceration was rare and expensive. Punishment needed to be quick and memorable. 2. Social control. Public violence sent strong warnings. In a world with minimal law enforcement, fear kept people obedient. 3. Religious worldview. Punishment was seen as moral correction. Pain cleansed sin. Suffering restored order. 4. Community justice. The public played an active role. Punishment wasn't just legal, it was social participation. Punishment as normalized violence. The medieval daily world was steeped in violence, at home, at work, in the streets, and in rituals of justice. Seeing someone whipped before breakfast barely raised eyebrows. Children grew up watching punishment so regularly that they became ordinary features of life. In such a society, violence wasn't shocking, it was instructional, predictable. Expected. Entertainment came with moral lessons and screaming, and everyone learned both. In medieval Europe, your social status didn't just shape your life, it shaped your likelihood of surviving it. Your class dictated diet, shelter, workload, medical care, and legal protection. Being poor was inherently dangerous. Poverty wasn't a phase, it was a hazard. Let's start with the most fundamental reality. Medieval society was a ladder where the bottom rungs were cracked, slippery, and occasionally on fire. At the top were the nobility, well-fed, well-armed, and well-protected. Below them were merchants and skilled craftsmen. Beneath those stood peasants, and beneath those stood the truly vulnerable, landless labourers, vagrants, widows without support, and children with no inheritance. Class didn't just determine comfort. It determined survival. The poor ate more danger than food. A noble's diet offered variety and abundance: meats, spices, bread made from sifted wheat, wine, imported fruits. But the poor, their meals were shaped by whatever they could scrape together. That meant watery stews stretched past the limits of generosity, grains full of stones or mould, dried peas that tasted like despair, and bread so rough it doubled as dental sandpaper. Hunger hit poor households long before it reached anyone else. When harvests failed, the wealthy bought extra grain. The middle class scrambled. The poor simply didn't eat. Famine wasn't an equalizer. It was a spotlight shining on class inequality. Starvation, malnutrition, and vitamin deficiencies weakened the poor from childhood. Their bodies fought constant battles against sickness with limited fuel. A noble could fall ill and recover. A peasant caught the same illness and died because hunger had already done half the job. Shelter was a social divide that defined survival. Medieval housing followed class lines with brutal clarity. Nobles lived in stone manors or castles with thick walls, hearths, and servants who maintained everything. Their homes weren't safe, nothing was safe, but they at least had barriers against weather, thieves, and wandering livestock. Peasants, however, lived in huts made of wood, mud, straw, and determination. Walls cracked, roofs leaked, floors were damp earth. Smoke hovered at head height, and winter cold crept in beneath the door with all the tact of an invading army. A bad storm didn't just inconvenience the poor, it threatened to collapse their homes entirely. And a collapsed house didn't just cause injury, it caused homelessness, a condition medieval society treated as a near-death sentence. Without land, income, or protection, you were exposed to cold, hunger, crime, and disease all at once. Workload varied by class, and the poor paid in pain. Nobles didn't avoid work entirely. They managed estates, trained for combat, negotiated alliances, but they rarely did labour that crippled bodies. Meanwhile, peasants worked from dawn until dusk, performing tasks that demanded endurance beyond human limits. Ploughing, hauling, lifting, digging, harvesting, building, and carrying. Landless labourers fared even worse. They had no farms of their own and hired themselves out for seasonal work. They lived in constant uncertainty. If no one needed extra hands, they didn't earn money. If they didn't earn money, they didn't eat. Work wasn't optional, it was oxygen. Exhaustion itself became a killer. A tired worker lost coordination, misjudged distances, or stumbled near tools and animals. Injury was common, recovery was rare, rest was impossible. And because the poor couldn't afford to stop working, they returned to labour before wounds healed, worsening their conditions until they became permanent disabilities. Legal protection was a privilege, not a right. Laws existed in medieval Europe, but their enforcement looked very different depending on your class. A noble accused of a crime negotiated, paid fines, or invoked powerful friends. A peasant accused of the same crime faced immediate punishment, and often harsher sentences. Testimonies from poor people carried less weight in court. Disputes involving wealthy landowners tended to end in the wealthy's favour. Crimes committed against the poor were overlooked. Crimes committed by the poor were punished brutally. If you were poor, you suffered from biased juries, corrupt officials' inability to pay fines, limited access to appeals, no representation, fewer rights in disputes, and the consequences weren't limited to legal matters. Poor people also received worse treatment in conflicts, raids, and political upheavals. During wars, nobles ransomed each other. Peasants were slaughtered. When bandits roamed, they targeted the poor first. They had fewer defences and more desperation. Sickness killed the poor. First and fastest, wealth brought safer food, better living conditions, and occasional, if questionable, medical visits. The poor relied on old remedies, community healers, prayer luck, and because disease spread in crowded, unsanitary living spaces, poor households were hit hardest and earliest. A single illness could sweep through cramped families sleeping together on straw mats, claiming children, parents, or elders with terrifying speed. The poor also lacked access to recovery foods, broth, meat, wine, fresh produce. Illness wasn't just dangerous, it was expensive. If you couldn't work, you didn't earn. If you didn't earn, your family starved. Getting sick carried economic penalties that made healing nearly impossible. Even death was class-based, burial reflected class as much as life did. Nobles received ornate ceremonies and carved tombs. The poor were buried in simple graves, often shared or unmarked. Their resting places forgotten even by those who mourned them. The medieval world didn't pretend class equality existed. It reinforced it constantly, visibly, painfully. Upward mobility. Not impossible, but very close. Stories exist of peasants rising through ranks, winning royal favour, or gaining wealth through trade. These stories are famous because they were so rare. Most people lived and died in the exact social position they were born into. A peasant child grew up to be a peasant adult. A servant's daughter became a servant. A landless labourer passed down landlessness like an heirloom of misfortune. Social status decided your body's fate long before life's dangers had a chance. The medieval class reality. If you were wealthy, you ate better, you lived safer, you received leniency, you healed faster, you survived longer. If you were poor, your food harmed you, your home endangered you, your work consumed you, your legal protection wavered, your illnesses escalated, your children died more frequently, you lived closer to death every day. Poverty wasn't a temporary inconvenience, it was a lifelong hazard, a quiet, constant threat woven into every breath, every meal, every winter, every task. In medieval Europe, your social class didn't just shape your life, it decided whether you lived long enough to have one. In medieval Europe, travel wasn't romantic. There were no scenic inns, no comfortable roads, no reassuring maps with helpful "you are here" markers. Every journey, whether 5 miles or 50, was a calculated gamble. Bad roads, bandits, disease, and weather made every step life-threatening. Staying home was often safer. Every trip had a chance of becoming your last. Let's start with the roads, which were less roads and more suggestions. Medieval routes were dirt paths worn by centuries of feet, hooves, and wheels. When dry, they were dusty, uneven, and full of ruts deep enough to snap an axle. When wet, they transformed into mud pits capable of swallowing carts, animals, and travellers with equal enthusiasm. Rain didn't just inconvenience journeys, it cancelled them completely. And if your wagon got stuck, you didn't call roadside assistance. You called anyone strong enough to help yank it out before the wheels sank deeper. Bridges weren't much help either. Some were sturdy stone structures built in busy towns, but most were wooden, narrow, tilting, or half-rotted. A horse could slip, a wheel could fall through, a bridge might collapse entirely under too much weight, and if there was no bridge available, you had to ford the river, risking slippery rocks, strong currents, cold shock, or being swept downstream with all your belongings. Maps, when they existed, were unreliable. Distances were estimates, landmarks were inconsistent, and directions from locals often sounded like riddle instructions. Keep walking until you see the crooked oak, then turn where the old mill used to be, and if you reach the marsh that smells like cabbage, you've gone too far. If you got lost, it was your own problem. But the true danger wasn't the road, it was who waited along it. Bandits, highwaymen, and desperate wanderers took advantage of isolated paths. Forests were perfect hunting grounds for criminals. Thick foliage concealed ambush sites. Narrow routes slowed travellers. Trees muffled cries for help. A lone traveller carrying goods was easy prey. Even groups weren't guaranteed safety. Some bandit gangs were large, organised, and experienced. They knew the terrain better than any traveller and were willing to use violence quickly if resistance appeared. Bandits didn't only steal valuables, they sometimes stole people. Ransom was a lucrative business, especially if the victim belonged to a wealthy family. For poorer travellers, violence was more common, because if you had nothing worth taking, the bandits at least wanted your silence. And forests weren't only filled with criminals, they also contained wolves, boars, and wild dogs, all capable of injuring or killing an unarmed traveller. People told stories of wanderers dragged off by wolves or gored by angry boars. Some stories were exaggerated, some were not. If you managed to avoid animal attacks, you still had to contend with weather, which behaved like an unpredictable overseer. A sudden storm could turn a safe path into a deadly one. Fog reduced visibility so drastically that travellers wandered in circles. Snow covered holes and obstacles, leading to twisted ankles or broken legs, injuries that could kill if you were far from help. Cold exposure led to hypothermia. Heat caused dehydration. Wind knocked down branches or blew travellers off narrow paths. Travellers often slept outdoors or in improvised shelters when inns weren't available. Many inns were expensive, unsafe, or so overcrowded that sleeping meant sharing space with strangers, animals, insects, and questionable smells. Floors were hard. Thieves operated inside as much as bandits did outside. Some innkeepers watered down ale, overcharged for meals, or simply robbed guests once they fell asleep. Lodging offered a roof, yes, but not always safety, and the people you met along the way could help or harm. Hospitality was a medieval virtue, but suspicion was equally common. Strangers were viewed with caution. Villages sometimes refused lodging to travellers out of fear of disease or theft. If you approached after dark, the response might be a closed gate or an armed greeting. Travellers without documentation or connections could easily be mistaken for vagrants, criminals, or spies. Disease also travelled easily along roads. Pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers carried illnesses unknowingly from region to region. Travellers often drank from streams, wells, or roadside puddles, any of which could carry sickness. A single bad drink could cut a journey short permanently. Merchants faced even greater risk. Their goods made them targets. They travelled with carts that moved slowly, breaking down frequently. A broken axle in a remote area wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Leaving goods behind meant losing your livelihood. Staying meant risking attack. Repairing meant expensive delays and potential exposure to weather or predators. Even mounted travellers weren't safe. Horses stumbled, saddles broke, hooves cracked, and a thrown rider could suffer injuries that left them helpless miles from the nearest settlement. Yet despite all this, medieval people had to travel. Pilgrims journeyed to holy sites to save their souls. Merchants sought markets to make a living. Messengers carried news across kingdoms. Families relocated for work, marriage, or survival. Soldiers marched constantly as wars reshaped the land. Travel was dangerous, but sometimes staying put was even more dangerous. To prepare, travellers carried walking sticks, daggers or short swords, water skins, bread and dried food, small charms for protection, and a deeply personal relationship with fear. Travellers often formed groups for safety. Pilgrim bands, merchant caravans, and wandering monks banded together, knowing collective survival was more likely than individual luck. But even groups weren't invincible. Some bandit ambushes targeted travellers specifically because they moved in groups. More people meant more goods. In medieval Europe, a journey wasn't just transportation. It was a test of endurance, caution, luck, and faith. Every mile asked a new question. Will you make it to the next one? Every traveller stepping onto a road accepted the truth. No matter how short the trip, every journey had a chance of becoming your last. In medieval Europe, weather wasn't an inconvenience, it was a tyrant. It ruled the calendar, dictated survival, and ignored every human plan with cheerful cruelty. Cold, heat, storms, and floods shaped daily life. Nature didn't negotiate. The forecast was always endure. To understand medieval weather's power, imagine a world without insulation, without forecasts, without emergency services, and without any sense of security. Weather could change instantly, violently, and fatally, and the medieval world had almost no tools to resist it. Cold, the silent executioner. Winter didn't simply arrive, it invaded. Cold seeped through walls, into bones, under blankets, and around hearths. Medieval houses were barely houses. Thin walls, open cracks, leaky roofs, and drafts that turned rooms into elaborate wind tunnels. A family could sit directly beside a fire and still feel the cold gnawing at their feet. Frost formed inside houses. Water froze in buckets left by the hearth. People slept fully clothed, wrapped in cloaks, sharing beds for warmth, sometimes even sleeping beside livestock because a breathing animal was better than freezing alone. Hypothermia didn't need a blizzard. It needed thin clothing, exhaustion, damp straw bedding, or a long walk home after sunset. And if you survived winter's cold, you still faced winter's hunger. Failing crops, scarcity of firewood, and diseases that thrived in cold, tight quarters all made winter a season of fear. Children struggled most. Elders followed close behind. Cold didn't just challenge the body, it punished it. Heat, the opposite problem, equally deadly. Summer brought a different enemy. Heat that scorched fields, dried rivers, and pushed workers past the limits of endurance. Medieval people laboured outdoors for long hours with no shade, no breaks, and no concept of hydration science. Water was often unsafe, and ale warmed quickly in the sun. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke didn't have names, but they had victims. People collapsed in fields. Children fainted. Workers grew delirious. And once dehydration set in, survival depended on luck and whatever fluids were available, usually lukewarm, questionable, and carried in leather skins. Heat also ruined crops. Cracked wooden structures spoiled food and invited insect swarms, especially locusts, which medieval people considered less an agricultural problem and more a biblical disaster. Rain, blessing, curse, and occupational hazard. Rain meant survival, unless it meant misery, destruction, or rising water levels. Medieval Europe needed rain desperately, but it needed it gently, and nature rarely delivered it gently. Light rain fed crops. Heavy rain drowned them. Thunderstorms brought roof leaks, chimney smoke blowing back into homes, flooded cellars, collapsing roads, and lightning fires. Medieval houses weren't sealed against moisture. When it rained, ceilings dripped, floors turned muddy, and bedding never dried. A wet bed in winter was a direct invitation to illness. Prolonged rain turned fields into swamps that swallowed boots and tools. Livestock struggled, harvests failed, hunger followed, and then came floods, which destroyed everything indiscriminately. Riverbanks overflowed, sweeping away. Entire villages, livestock, crops, tools stored, grain bridges, roads. A flood could set a community back years, if they recovered at all. Storms, nature's loudest warning. Storms in the medieval world weren't background noise. They were terrifying, powerful, and dangerous. Thunder shook buildings. Lightning struck churches, barns, and cottages. Winds tore thatch from roofs and sent debris flying. Villagers huddled in fear, listening to the walls crack and the wind howl through gaps. Storms didn't respect timing. If a tempest arrived during harvest or travel, lives were at risk. People saw storms as divine messages, angry gods, demons fighting, cosmic displeasure. Whatever the explanation, everyone agreed on one point. A medieval storm meant stay inside, pray, and hope the roof didn't rip off. Wind, the invisible threat. Wind could be more dangerous than rain. Strong gusts toppled trees, destroyed chimneys, and blew out cooking fires, sometimes onto flammable floors or walls. High winds turned thatched roofs into kindling. A single spark, knocked loose by a gust, could lead to an entire village burning down. Windstorms also made travel nearly impossible. Riders were unseated, ferries capsized, merchants lost goods as wagons tipped over. Coastal towns suffered from storm surges and flooding that reshaped their shorelines. Wind didn't need a name like cyclone or hurricane to ruin a settlement. It simply needed a determined afternoon. Seasonal uncertainty, nature's favourite game. Medieval people depended entirely on the seasons. Planting, harvesting, storing, and surviving all depended on stable patterns. When weather changed unexpectedly, disaster followed. A late frost could kill entire fields of young plants. An early frost could destroy crops almost ready for harvest. Too much rain ruined grain. Too little rain shriveled everything. A year with unpredictable weather meant famine, migration, or death. No forecasts, no warnings, no second chances. There were no meteorologists, no alerts, no charts, no long-range predictions. People read signs in the sky, the behavior of animals or the position of stars, but most predictions were hopeful guesses. A storm might arrive in an hour or a day or not at all. A warm week might turn icy overnight. A gentle summer might erupt into drought. Nature didn't negotiate, it didn't bargain, it didn't warn. It simply acted, and humans reacted, often too late. Weather is the everyday enemy. Weather shaped what you wore, what you ate, how you worked, whether your home stood, how many children survived, which diseases spread where you travelled, whether you travelled at all. It was the single most powerful force in medieval life, greater than kings, armies, or religion. The poor suffered the worst, but even the wealthy couldn't escape the consequences of a harsh winter or a catastrophic storm. Nature didn't care about your status, only about your exposure. In medieval Europe, weather wasn't just the backdrop, it was the antagonist, the unpredictable, unstoppable foe everyone feared. The forecast was always endure, and survival depended on doing exactly that. In medieval Europe, faith wasn't a quiet personal experience. It was an ever-present force shaping thought, behavior, and anxiety. Spiritual anxiety, sin, and divine punishment formed a constant background hum beneath everyday life. Fear followed you everywhere. You weren't just surviving, you were being judged. To understand why religion carried such weight, you must picture a world with no scientific explanations, no clear health knowledge, no meteorology, no psychology, and no understanding of luck beyond God allowed this, or God is displeased. Everything, absolutely everything, was interpreted through a religious lens. If lightning struck your barn, God sent a warning. If your child survived an illness, God granted mercy. If your crops failed, God was testing you or punishing you. If you slipped on the street, God probably had notes for your behavior. This worldview wasn't optional. It shaped society from birth to burial. Sin, the invisible threat. Medieval people believed that sin wasn't just moral, it was dangerous. A sinful act offended God, invited punishment, and threatened the entire community. One person's wrongdoing could, in the medieval imagination, bring famine, storm, plague, or misfortune upon everyone nearby. Sin wasn't private, it was contagious. This made daily life feel like walking through a spiritual minefield. Were you speaking too proudly? That was vanity. Did you think something improper? That was lust or envy. Did you skip prayers because you were exhausted after working from dawn till dusk? That was sloth, even if your muscles said otherwise. Every action had a spiritual counterpart. Anger risked losing your soul. Greed risked divine wrath. Too much joy risked becoming a temptation. Too much sadness risked drifting toward despair, a sin in itself. And of course, the worst fear of all, dying with unconfessed sin. People worried endlessly about sudden death because the state of your soul at the moment of death was believed to determine your eternity. A fall, infection, accident, fire, or crime could end life instantly and condemn you. This anxiety never left medieval minds. Hell, a vivid and constant threat. Medieval sermons didn't gently describe the afterlife. They painted detailed cinematic depictions of hellfire, demons, eternal torture, and endless suffering. Artists filled churches with images of sinners being devoured, burned, stretched, or mocked by devils. Children saw these images weekly. Adults saw them daily. Fear wasn't an unintended byproduct. It was the goal. Fear kept you obedient. Fear kept you humble. Fear kept you inside the boundaries of expected behavior. Hell wasn't a distant theological concept. It was a vivid possibility your priest reminded you of every Sunday. Divine punishment. Everywhere. All the time. People believed God actively intervened in daily life. This meant Bad weather signaled moral failing. Illness signaled divine correction. Natural disasters signaled widespread sin. Misfortune signaled personal flaws. And sudden accidents signaled cosmic warnings. If your roof collapsed, villagers didn't ask about architectural stability. They wondered what spiritual lesson you were supposed to learn. If your cow died unexpectedly, maybe you needed confession. If your child fell sick, maybe your neighbour's sin was affecting the community. Religion provided comfort, yes, but also relentless scrutiny. The church was the centre of everything. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval society. Daily prayers structured the hours, bells rang out the rhythm of life, feast days dictated rest, fasting seasons shaped diet, rites marked major life events, birth, marriage, death. The church decided what books were copied, what ideas were acceptable, what behaviour was sinful, and what beliefs were heretical. It held enormous authority, and speaking against it, even accidentally, carried life-ending consequences. Priests mediated between people and God. They were shepherds of faith, but they also wielded immense social power. They could shame families publicly, bless or condemn marriages, settle disputes, and interpret scripture with wide-reaching consequences. Villagers didn't just fear divine judgment, they feared ecclesiastical judgment too. Supernatural beings, more things to fear. Medieval Christianity coexisted with old folklore and traditional beliefs. People feared demons, witches, restless spirits, cursed places, sacred relics that could punish misuse, saints who rewarded devotion but punished disrespect. Spiritual beings weren't metaphorical. They were treated as active participants in everyday life. Children were told angels watched them. Adults were told demons tempted them. Elders were told saints judged them. The world felt crowded with invisible witnesses and invisible dangers, confession and the endless cycle of anxiety. Confession offered relief, but temporary relief. People confessed their sins regularly, but temptation was believed to lurk everywhere, waiting to drag them back into error. A careless word, a moment of jealousy, a brief lapse in charity, all required spiritual clean-up. And confessing too little was dangerous. Confessing too much was suspicious. Confessing incorrectly risked missing crucial sins. Religion provided a path to salvation, but made the journey feel like balancing on a rope stretched over a pit of fire. Public penance and religious shame. Just as crime carried public consequences, religious sin sometimes required public penance. Wearing distinctive clothing of shame, standing before the community during Mass, walking barefoot as a sign of humility, making offerings, accepting symbolic punishment. People watched, judged, whispered, and remembered. Social reputation wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. A single public failing could mark a family for generations. The fear of heresy. A social death sentence. Questioning religious doctrine wasn't brave, it was suicidal. Heretics were punished severely, often executed. People feared being associated with suspicious ideas. Even discussing theology outside accepted norms was dangerous. This meant self-censorship was constant. People kept silent. People avoided questions. People followed tradition rigidly because deviation held catastrophic consequences. Comfort and burden intertwined. Despite the fear, religion also offered community, rituals of stability, hope of salvation, meaning during suffering, and a sense of order in a chaotic world. But the comfort and the fear existed together, inseparable. Faith sustained people, but terrified them too. The medieval spiritual reality. Imagine living a life where every misfortune had cosmic implications, every success required gratitude, every mistake carried eternal consequences, every dream, illness, storm, and accident needed religious interpretation. You weren't just trying to survive nature, disease, hunger, and danger. You were trying to survive judgment from God, from priests, from neighbours, from yourself. In medieval Europe, living was hard, but living righteously, that felt like walking a tightrope strung across eternity. In medieval Europe, mental stress wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a permanent roommate. Loss, death, uncertainty, and fear were part of daily life. There was no escape from anxiety because anxiety was simply the default state of existence. Peace of mind was a luxury item. To understand medieval mental strain, you must remove every modern cushion that makes uncertainty feel manageable. There were no therapists, no support groups, no self-help guides, no reliable medicine, no stable economies, no predictable weather, no safety nets, and no concept of mental health outside sin, spirits, or temperament. The world was a swirling mixture of unpredictability and threat, and medieval people lived inside it without protective barriers. Death was constant company. The medieval mind lived with death not as an abstraction but as a daily presence. Children died frequently. Adults died young. Loved ones vanished from disease, accidents, winter, famine, war, childbirth, infection, or simple misfortune. A child could wake up with a fever and be dead by sundown. A harvest could fail and doom entire villages. A traveller could leave home and never return. A cut could fester. A mother could die in childbirth. A neighbour could fall into the river. A horse could kick a farmer. A fire could destroy a home within minutes. Death wasn't shocking. It was familiar. But familiarity didn't make it easier. Behind the stoicism, medieval people displayed lay-deep, unspoken grief. Families mourned constantly, often silently, because grief was expected and life demanded immediate continuation. There was no space or time for emotional recovery. Work pressure was relentless. Survival was a full-time job. There were no days off. There was no cushion between hunger and plenty. Every morning began with a question: will we have enough? Enough food, enough firewood, enough health, enough luck? Failing in work didn't mean reprimand. It meant starvation. And the mind never forgot it. Farmers felt pressure at planting and harvest. Craftsmen worried about market demand. Labourers feared unemployment. Merchants feared bandits. Women feared injury that could slow them down. Children feared disappointing their families. Everyone feared winter. This constant tension built into the medieval psyche, a quiet, persistent background hum of pressure that never ended. Fear of the unknown, a daily companion. The medieval world lacked explanations for almost everything that affected life. Without science or reliable knowledge, uncertainty filled every corner. Why did someone get sick? Why did crops fail? Why did a storm strike one village and spare another? Why did one child thrive while another wasted away? Why did prayers work sometimes but not others? Mystery wasn't intriguing. It was terrifying. Life felt like a game governed by invisible forces whose rules changed constantly. You did your best, and then hoped fate felt generous that day. Lack of control fueled stress. Modern life allows many small ways to control risk: insurance, medicine, forecasts, savings, support systems. Medieval people had none of these. Control was an illusion. A single event, harvest failure, a house fire, injury, illness, could destroy a family's stability permanently. Any sense of security was fragile, momentary, and largely imaginary. People coped by leaning on prayer, tradition, community rituals, superstition, and grit. But none of these erased the sense that life balanced constantly on a knife's edge. Grief without closure. Medieval people had rituals for mourning, but no psychological framework for healing. They buried loved ones and returned to work because survival demanded it. Unprocessed grief built up. Parents burying multiple children, children losing siblings, spouses losing partners, communities losing neighbors, families losing generations to famine. Life didn't pause. None of the emotional weight went away. It simply settled deeper. Anxiety around reputation and honor. In small communities, reputation was everything. A rumor could ruin marriage prospects, job prospects, friendships, and trust. Being seen as lazy, sinful, unlucky, or cursed came with real consequences. Moreover, religious fear, social expectations, moral standards, and strict community norms all combined to create environments where people constantly monitored themselves and each other. The stress of maintaining a good reputation, especially in a harsh world, was immense. Community tension and social conflict villages were small. Privacy was nearly non-existent. People lived, worked, argued, gossiped, and cooperated in tight conditions. Conflicts festered. Grudges lasted generations. Fear of offending someone, stepping out of line, or becoming the subject of gossip contributed to constant tension. You couldn't escape difficult people by moving towns. Travel was dangerous and expensive. You lived with your stressors indefinitely. Fear shaped by religion. Spiritual fear amplified mental strain. People worried about sin, divine judgment, damnation, displeasing saints, curses, demonic temptation, accidentally inviting spiritual danger. The medieval world layered eternal consequences onto every mistake. Anxiety about salvation wasn't occasional, it was chronic. Nighttime was its own stress category. Darkness wasn't peaceful. It brought wolves, thieves, spirits in the medieval imagination, accidents, fires, freezing temperatures, isolation. Most households had a single candle or hearth for light. Shadows were long, unpredictable, and frightening. People told stories of wandering spirits and demons not because they were entertaining, but because the night made the world feel alive with threat. No language for mental health. Medieval people had no words for trauma, stress, depression, or anxiety. Emotional suffering was described in spiritual terms: melancholy, black bile, divine testing, demonic influence, or weak faith. Without understanding the mind's needs, people couldn't articulate their inner struggles. Stress became woven into identity, not recognized as a burden. Resilience was required, not praised. Despite all this, medieval people adapted. They developed emotional endurance that seems superhuman by modern standards. Humor, community gatherings, seasonal feasts, and family bonds offered brief relief. People learned to take joy where they found it, even amid hardship. But none of that erased the mental strain. It merely softened it enough to keep going. Medieval life wasn't just physically dangerous, it was mentally exhausting. Fear, uncertainty, grief, and pressure shaped every day. Peace of mind didn't come naturally. It came briefly, if at all. In medieval Europe, staying alive wasn't something you hoped to do, it was something you worked to do. Every action, from eating to sleeping, required awareness. Relaxation was risky. Staying alive was a full-time job with no breaks. The medieval mindset was shaped by necessity. People didn't wake up in the morning thinking, "What should I do today?" They woke up thinking, "What must I avoid today?" Danger was everywhere. In the home, on the streets, in the fields, in food, in tools, in animals, in weather, in water, and even within one's own body. This constant exposure trained medieval people to live with an alertness that bordered on instinctual. Vigilance wasn't a skill, it was a reflex. Sleeping required strategy. Sleep, ideally, should be restful. In medieval Europe, sleep was a negotiation. You had to choose where to lie so drafts didn't freeze you, how far from the hearth to avoid sparks or suffocation, whether the bedding contained insects or fleas, whether livestock inside the house would step on you, and whether the door needed securing against thieves or hungry animals. Even nighttime sounds were suspicious. A creaking board, a howling wind, a scratching rat, or a rattling latch, all could signal danger. Medieval households often slept lightly because true rest was unsafe. A deep sleeper wasn't admired. They were considered vulnerable. Meals needed attention. Eating, in theory, should be joyful. In medieval Europe, it required concentration. You checked the bread for stones from grinding. You checked the stew for bones that could crack teeth. You checked the drink for debris, insects, or contamination. You checked smells for signs of spoilage. You checked the bowl for cracks that might spill scalding liquid onto your lap. Every meal carried risk. A careless bite could chip a tooth or choke you. A poorly cooked dish could sicken you. A contaminated drink could finish you. Food wasn't simply nourishment, it was a survival challenge. Walking was a calculated process. Taking a stroll through a medieval town wasn't relaxing. It was an obstacle course. You had to. Avoid waste tossed from windows, dodge carts rolling unpredictably, step around roaming animals, balance on muddy or uneven ground, skirt open drainage trenches, and keep distance from strangers who might pickpocket or shove. Falling wasn't a slapstick mishap. It was a life-threatening event. A crack in the street could twist an ankle. A wet patch could knock you off balance. A fall into a ditch could break bones or introduce infection. Villagers walked with the cautious awareness of people who knew the ground beneath them held grudges. Working required constant calculation. Whether in a field, workshop, or household, work demanded continuous alertness because tools and environments were unforgiving. A distracted farmer could misjudge a swing of the scythe. A distracted carpenter could slip a knife into their own hand, and a distracted cook could burn themselves or knock a hot pot onto a child. Tools didn't care about fatigue, animals didn't care about your schedule, and weather didn't care about your projects. One lapse in attention could ruin a body part or a life. People didn't just work hard, they worked carefully, because working carelessly was an express route to disaster. Children needed watching. Constantly medieval parents loved their children, but they also understood an unsettling truth. A child left unsupervised for 5 minutes could find danger with supernatural speed. Children could fall into open wells, wander into rivers, stumble into hearths, get kicked by animals, ingest poisonous plants, or follow strangers out of curiosity. Parents, already exhausted, needed vigilance simply to prevent survival statistics from worsening. Childhood wasn't protected, and any lapse could lead to irreversible tragedy. Travel required awareness at every step. Whether walking to a neighbouring village or travelling miles to a market, journeying demanded uninterrupted attention. Travellers scanned the road for bandits. They watched tree lines for movement. They judged the sky for shifting storms. They listened for approaching footsteps. Even resting beneath a tree required caution. Sleep could leave you vulnerable to thieves, animals, or exposure. Travel was mentally exhausting because vigilance couldn't relax until you were home again, and sometimes not even then. Neighbours needed monitoring. 2 medieval villages were tightly knit, but not always peacefully. Disputes could escalate into violence. Gossip travelled faster than truth. Old grudges simmered for decades. Vigilance wasn't only about physical danger, it was also about social danger. One poorly timed comment could create an enemy. One misunderstanding could spread rapidly. One accusation could ruin lives. People learned to weigh every word, every gesture, every silence. Being careless socially could be as dangerous as being careless physically. Animals needed constant watching. Livestock were essential, but also dangerous. Cows trampled, horses kicked, pigs bit, goats escaped. Even chickens pecked small children hard enough to cause infection. Animals didn't follow instructions, they followed instincts. Living around them required alertness to avoid unpredictable accidents. Nature required respect at all times. A sudden storm could flatten crops or flood a home. Wind could tear roofs from cottages. Heat could kill livestock. Cold could freeze water supplies. People watched the skies like hawks. They read the air, the light, the sound of birds, the movement of smoke, the shape of clouds, anything that might hint at changing weather. Ignoring nature wasn't bravery. It was recklessness. Night required extra caution. When darkness fell, vigilance increased tenfold. No streetlights, no lanterns outside, just shadows and danger. Night was when thieves prowled, wolves approached, drunk brawlers roamed, and fires spread unseen. Medieval people barred doors, secured animals, banked fires, and prayed nothing visited them unexpectedly. Night wasn't a time to relax, it was a time to survive. Mental fatigue was constant, but normalized. Living with such vigilance produced a level of mental strain we can hardly comprehend. But medieval people didn't see it as stress. They saw it as life. You stayed alert because alertness kept you breathing. Not overreacting meant underpreparing. Not preparing meant risking disaster. Not staying vigilant meant inviting danger. Relaxation was a rare luxury, granted only in brief moments at festivals, after harvest, or in the quiet moments of shared meals. Even then, a part of the mind stayed awake. In medieval Europe, survival was an active process, a job with no breaks, shifts, or holidays. And if you forgot that even briefly, the world around you was quick to remind you. The good news? Millions survived medieval life. The bad news? They did it by accepting danger as normal. This final reflection reveals a truth at the heart of medieval Europe. People did not endure because they were reckless or ignorant. They endured because they adapted. They were realistic. They survived a world where risk was not an interruption but a permanent condition. To grasp this resilience, one must first understand how medieval people perceived reality. Modern minds expect safety, predictability, and control. Medieval minds expected the opposite. They didn't assume tomorrow was guaranteed. They didn't assume health was stable. They didn't assume life would follow a pleasant trajectory. Instead, they treated survival as a daily accomplishment, one achieved through community, habit, vigilance, and quiet strength. Danger didn't shock them. Medieval life was a tapestry woven with threat, fire, disease, injury, weather, accidents, crime, hunger, childbirth, animals, tools, travel, and social pressures created an environment where danger wasn't an intruder. It was the background music of existence. Where modern people would panic, medieval people recalculated. Where modern people would freeze, medieval people acted. Where modern people would demand an explanation, medieval people accepted uncertainty. Their worldview wasn't fatalistic. It was pragmatic. If life was fragile, then every victory over it, each sunrise, harvest, recovery, and homecoming, was meaningful. Resilience wasn't a choice, it was a requirement. Survival required skills that began in childhood. Children learned to work, to observe, to avoid hazards, to interpret danger signs, and to cope with loss from an early age. Adults honed these skills further, carving out lives shaped by constant adaptation. But resilience didn't mean they were emotionless. Medieval people grieved deeply. They feared, they worried, they suffered. Yet they continued because stopping was never an option. Responsibility to family, land, community, and faith overpowered personal despair. This endurance formed the backbone of medieval society. Without it, Europe would not have survived famine cycles, disease waves, wars, and climate shifts. Communities functioned because people worked together. No one survived medieval life alone. Communities shared labour, food, tools, childcare, gossip, news, worries, and hope. Cooperation was not idealism. It was survival strategy. Villagers repaired homes together after storms. Families helped each other harvest before weather ruined the crops. Neighbours nursed the sick when illness spread. Entire communities gathered to defend against threats, whether wolves, bandits, or fire. Support networks were not formal systems, they were human instinct. In a world where death lurked in something as small as a cut or as large as a war, people relied on one another constantly. This interdependence was the secret ingredient that kept medieval society functioning, despite overwhelming challenges. Adaptation was practical, not heroic. Modern stories often dramatize medieval courage, but everyday bravery looked far simpler. Checking bread for stones before eating, tying a roof tighter before winter storms, avoiding contaminated water, watching children closely in hazardous environments, learning the patterns of weather and animals, stepping carefully on uneven roads, keeping tools maintained as best as possible, sleeping lightly to listen for danger. These were small decisions, repeated thousands of times across a lifetime, that added up to survival. Medieval people didn't think of themselves as brave, they thought of themselves as living. They understood risk better than we do. Modern society has an unparalleled ability to prevent danger. We carry insurance, wear protective gear, take medicines, predict storms, and trust emergency services. Medieval society had none of these. They didn't romanticize risk. They didn't underestimate it. They lived with it intimately every day. They knew when ice was too thin to cross, when fever meant danger, when clouds signaled an approaching storm, when an animal's behavior predicted trouble, when a stranger's manner signaled distrust, when a tool could betray them, when a smell meant food was unsafe. Their understanding of risk wasn't scientific, but it was experiential, instinctive, and often accurate. They survived because they learned patterns modern people no longer recognize. Hardship created strength, but also compassion. Modern betrayal sometimes reduced medieval people to hardened survivors, but hardship didn't just toughen them, it also softened them in subtle ways. They understood grief because everyone experienced it. They understood labor because everyone worked. They understood vulnerability because everyone was at the mercy of nature. They understood fear because danger visited every household. This produced societies where communal rituals, feasting, storytelling, praying, mourning, were essential threads holding life together. The medieval world was harsh, but it was also deeply human. The good news and the bad news revisited. The good news. Medieval people were astonishingly adaptable. They endured conditions that seem unimaginable today. Their resilience shaped cultures, built societies, and carried humanity through centuries of instability. The bad news, they had to be that resilient. The world offered them no softness, no mercy, and no escape from constant vigilance. They survived not because life was kind, but because they matched it with strength, realism, humor, and community. Final reflection. Medieval Europe wasn't a world of heroic epics or cinematic battles. It was a world of ordinary people doing extraordinary things quietly, daily, and without recognition. They carried burdens modern people rarely consider. They navigated danger with humility and acceptance. They held on to hope not because life was easy, but because life required it. Millions survived medieval life. They did it by adapting to danger, expecting hardship, leaning on each other, and embracing resilience as a way of being. They weren't reckless. They weren't naive. They were realistic, in the most challenging world imaginable.